Hey there! This time, we're going on a long journey back in time to a world of deserts, kings, and prophets. In the stories we'll hear tonight, the impossible happens all the time. You'll see hungry people get food from a place with no stores. You'll see scared people become safe from a whole army. And you'll see a giant lion become as gentle as a kitten. These stories show that God can do anything, and he did these things to help and protect the people who trusted him. Close your eyes and let the journey start. Chapter 1. God creates the world. Before time began, there was only a formless, silent darkness, an endless deep waiting for a voice to call it into being. Then, into that profound emptiness, a single command echoed, a word of such power and love that it shattered the eternal night. Light burst forth, radiant and pure, separating day from night in a glorious, spinning dance. The voice spoke again, and a vault of sky arched overhead, a brilliant blue dome holding back the chaotic waters. Land rose from the seas, rich and dark, eager for life. At the sound of the same voice, the earth itself began to clothe the bare soil. A carpet of grass unfurled, and trees of every kind pushed toward the sun, heavy with fruit and seed. The Creator painted the world with the vibrant green of leaves, the brilliant red of blossoms, and the deep gold of ripe grain. Then the skies and waters teemed with life. Great whales moved through the deep, and birds with wings of every color filled the air with their first songs. The land stirred with the movement of creatures, cattle lowing in the meadows, lions stretching in the sun, and every crawling thing finding its place in the new world. Each animal, each plant was declared good, a perfect piece of a perfect whole. But the masterpiece was yet to come. From the dust of the ground, the Creator formed a man, breathing into him the very breath of life. Adam awoke, the first human soul, and walked in the garden crafted just for him, a place of breathtaking beauty called Eden. Rivers clear as crystal wound through it, water and trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. At the garden's heart stood two unique trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam gave names to all the creatures, but among them he found no companion suitable for him. So, as he slept, the Creator took a rib from his side, and from it fashioned a woman, Eve. When Adam saw her, he recognized her as bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh, a perfect partner in the paradise they now shared. Each day, as the cool evening breeze swept through the garden, the voice of God walked with them. There was no shame, no fear, and no want. They conversed freely with their Creator, their hearts fully known and fully loved. They tended the garden, their work a joy, and their companionship complete. Every fruit was theirs to enjoy, every sunset a shared wonder. The world was new, untouched by sorrow or death, a testament to the ultimate power and profound loving care of the God who spoke it all into existence. Everything was very good. Chapter 2. Noah and the Great Flood. The perfect harmony of the garden had long since fractured, its memory a fading echo in a world now steeped in its own corruption. The descendants of Adam and Eve, who had once walked in the cool of the day with God, now filled the earth with violence and a clamor of wickedness that rose like a foul stench to the heavens. Human imagination conceived only evil continually. Their hearts turned inward, away from the light and toward the shadows they themselves had embraced. The beautiful creation groaned under the weight of its own decay, and the justice of a holy God could no longer tolerate the infection of sin that had spread to every corner of the earth. Yet, in the midst of the overwhelming darkness, one man found favor. Noah was a righteous man, a solitary figure who walked faithfully with God while the world around him descended into chaos. His life was a quiet protest against the tide of evil, a testament to a different way. And so, God spoke to Noah, unveiling a terrifying and sorrowful plan. The earth, defiled by the bloodshed and corruption of humanity, would be cleansed. A great flood was coming, a deluge to wipe every living thing from the face of the ground. But for Noah, there was a command that carried the weight of salvation. Build an ark. The instructions were precise and monumental. A massive vessel of gopher wood, sealed with pitch inside and out, was to rise in a place far from any sea. It was to have rooms upon rooms, 3 decks reaching toward the sky, a floating mountain of a ship constructed on dry land. For decades, the rhythmic sounds of sawing and hammering filled the air, a strange symphony of obedience amidst the jeers and mockery of his neighbors. Noah, with his sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, worked with unwavering faith, a faith that believed in the warning of a storm they could not yet see in a cloudless sky. Then came the gathering. At God's command, the animals began to arrive, not in a panicked stampede, but in a solemn, ordered procession. Creatures of every kind came in pairs, male and female, their instincts overruled by a divine directive. The great cats padded silently into the ark. The herds of deer and cattle followed. The birds of every plumage fluttered to their perches, and the creeping things found their corners in the deep holds of the ship. The air buzzed with the beating of 1,000,000 wings and rustled with the movement of countless feet, a living tapestry of the creation being preserved. Finally, Noah and his wife, his sons and their wives, 8 souls in all, entered the ark, and God himself shut them in. The massive door, a final barrier between the old world and the new, sealed with a definitive, echoing thud. For 7 days, an eerie calm held the earth. Then the fountains of the great deep burst forth, tearing open the seams of the world as torrents of water geysered from the earth's core. At the same moment, the windows of the heavens were thrown open, and rain fell in a ceaseless, deafening curtain, not for hours or days, but for 40 days and 40 nights. The waters rose, swallowing the hills, then the mountains, until the highest peaks were buried under the relentless churning sea. Every living thing that breathed on dry land perished. The cacophony of a wicked world silenced beneath the waves. Only the ark remained, buoyed on the surface of the deep, a lonely wooden world adrift on an endless ocean of judgment. For 150 days, the waters prevailed upon the earth. Inside the ark, life was sustained, a microcosm of the world that was, waiting for the judgment to pass. Eventually, God sent a wind over the earth, and the waters began to recede. The ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, a beacon of hope on a mud-slicked, desolate world. Noah sent out a raven, then a dove, to test the state of the earth. When the dove returned with a freshly plucked olive leaf, it was a sign that life was pushing through the destruction. When it did not return, the earth was dry. Noah, his family, and every creature emerged from the ark onto the quiet, cleansed earth. The first thing Noah did was to build an altar to the Lord, a sacrifice of thanksgiving that rose as a pleasing aroma. And God made a promise, a covenant with Noah and all living creatures, sealed with a sign in the clouds. Never again would a flood be sent to destroy all life. The bow appeared in the sky, a breathtaking arc of brilliant color against the retreating storm clouds. A rainbow. It was a permanent sign of God's mercy, a promise of His enduring faithfulness, and a reminder that His justice is always tempered with grace for those who, like Noah, choose to walk with Him in trust. Chapter 3. Abraham's Amazing Promise. The sun beat down on the tents of Hebron, baking the dust around a camp that had known decades of wandering. Within one of those tents, an elderly man named Abram, now called Abraham, sat in the shade, the lines on his face a map of a long life of faith and waiting. His wife Sarai, now Sarah, moved quietly nearby, her own body a testament to the long, barren years that had stretched their hope thin. They were wealthy, respected, and blessed in every way but one, the one way that mattered most in their world. Their tent had never echoed with the laughter of a child. Their legacy was a silent, aching void. One day, as the heat of the day began to wane, 3 visitors appeared near their encampment. Abraham, with the instinctive hospitality of the desert, rushed to welcome them, urging them to rest and partake of a meal. As they ate, one of the visitors, whose presence carried an undeniable weight of authority, posed a simple, earth-shattering question. He asked after Sarah. Then came the promise, spoken not as a hopeful possibility, but as a certain, impending fact. By this time next year, the visitor declared, Sarah would have a son. From her place just inside the tent flap, Sarah heard the words. A sound escaped her lips before she could stifle it. A short, sharp, bitter laugh that was the accumulation of a lifetime of disappointment. Her body was as good as dead for childbearing, her womb long since dried up. Abraham, too, was far advanced in years. The promise was not just unlikely, it was a biological absurdity. The laughter was not one of joy, but of a heart that had learned to shield itself from the pain of impossible hopes. The visitor turned his gaze toward the tent, his eyes seeming to see straight through the woven goat hair. He asked Abraham why Sarah had laughed. He repeated the impossible question, Is anything too hard for the Lord? Fear washed over Sarah, and she denied it. But the visitor knew. He knew the laugh, and he knew the wounded heart from which it sprang. Yet the promise stood unshaken by human disbelief. The words hung in the air, a divine seed planted in the barren soil of human reality. Months passed, the seasons turned. Then a strange and wonderful stirring began within Sarah's aged body. A flutter, a quickening, a sensation she had long ago resigned to never feeling. The impossible was taking root. Her thin frame slowly swelled with a life that defied every law of nature. Wonder replaced skepticism, and a fragile, burgeoning hope began to crowd out the decades of despair. The God who had spoken the universe into existence was now performing a quiet, intimate miracle within her. When the time came, the pain of childbirth, a pain she had never expected to know, gave way to a cry that shattered the silence of the tent, the fierce, healthy wail of a newborn son. Abraham, his own hands gnarled with age, took the child, his eyes brimming with tears of joy and disbelief. They named him Isaac, which means he laughs. This time the laughter was different. It was not the bitter scoff of disbelief, but the overflowing, joyous laughter of divine fulfillment. Sarah held her son, her Isaac, and her heart felt as if it would burst. She declared that God had brought her laughter and that everyone who heard would laugh with her. The sound of a baby's coos and cries now filled the space where silence had once reigned, a living, breathing testimony to a promise kept. The birth of Isaac was more than the arrival of a long-awaited heir. It was the cracking open of human limitation by the hand of a faithful God. In the face of a dead womb and a hopeless situation, God had proven that His Word is the ultimate reality. The joy that filled Abraham and Sarah's tent was not just the joy of parenthood, but the profound, soul-shaking joy that comes when God fulfills His word against every odd in His perfect time and for His glorious purpose. The child of promise, born from laughter, became the living proof that with God nothing is too wonderful. Chapter 4. Jacob's Dream of a Ladder. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, casting long, desperate shadows that seemed to chase Jacob as he fled. Each hurried step away from Beersheba was a step deeper into the wilderness of his own making. The bitter taste of deceit still fresh on his tongue. He had stolen his brother's birthright and his father's blessing, and now the price was Esau's murderous rage, a heat he could feel on the back of his neck, even miles from home. The vast, open landscape offered no comfort, only exposure. The wind sweeping across the barren hills carried no sound but the echo of his own guilt and the whispered threats of a future unraveled. He was utterly alone, a fugitive with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of a broken family. As the last light bled from the sky, he found a place to rest, a patch of stony ground with no shelter. Weariness overcame him, a heavy cloak of physical and emotional exhaustion. He selected a stone from the hard earth, its surface cool and unyielding, and placed it beneath his head as a pillow. It was a testament to his desolation, a bed of dust and a pillow of rock for the air of God's promise. Closing his eyes, the emptiness of the land seeped into his soul, and he surrendered to a deep, troubled sleep. Then the dream began. It did not creep into his mind, but erupted from it, a vision of breathtaking clarity and scale. There, set upon the earth with its top reaching to the heavens, was a ladder. It was not a structure built by human hands, but a magnificent living conduit between the realms of dust and divinity. Its form was of light and substance, each rung a step in an infinite ascent. And upon it, angels of God were ascending and descending, their movements a silent, graceful symphony of purpose. They were messengers, their continuous traffic a vivid display of a connection he had thought severed, a constant, vibrant exchange between the God of his fathers and the weary world below. Then a presence descended, not upon the ladder, but standing beside him, a manifestation of glory that filled the dream without consuming it. It was the Lord, and he spoke, his voice not a sound that entered the ears, but a truth that resonated directly in the spirit. He identified himself as the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, anchoring his promise in the lineage Jacob had so desperately tried to manipulate. The land upon which Jacob slept, this lonely, stony patch of wilderness, was promised to him and his descendants. They would be as numerous as the dust of the earth, a multitude spreading in all directions. And in his offspring, all the families of the earth would be blessed. But the most profound words were for Jacob, the solitary fugitive. "Behold, I am with you," the voice declared, a promise that addressed his deepest fear, the fear of abandonment. "I will keep you wherever you go." The assurance was not conditional upon Jacob's righteousness or his cleverness. It was a blanket of divine protection, a vow of presence that would follow him into the unknown land of his exile and would one day bring him back to this very ground. The God of the universe was pledging himself to a deceitful man on the run, promising not to leave him until every word was fulfilled. Jacob awoke with a start, the first rays of dawn painting the eastern sky. The stone was still hard beneath his head, the wilderness still stretched out around him, but everything was different. A holy awe gripped him, a visceral understanding that the desolate place where he had slept was none other than the house of God, the very gate of heaven. The loneliness that had plagued him was now filled with a palpable sacred presence. He took the stone that had been his pillow, set it upright as a pillar, and anointed it with oil, consecrating the spot as a memorial. This was Bethel, the house of God, a place where heaven had touched his broken earth. A vow formed in his heart, not as a negotiation with God, but as a response to the overwhelming grace he had been shown. If God would indeed be with him, protect him, provide for him, and bring him safely home, then this God would be his God. The stone pillar would stand as a witness, and of all that God gave him, he would return a tenth. It was the birth of a covenant relationship, forged not in a patriarch's tent, but on a rocky hillside with a runaway. The dream of the latter faded with the morning stars, but its truth remained. God's guidance is not reserved for the righteous in their homes, but extends even to the guilty on their journeys, and his constant presence is the one sure thing in a world of shifting sand. Chapter 5. Joseph's Colorful Coat and Dreams. The coat was a masterpiece of provocation, a garment woven not just from fine wool, but from a father's undisguised favoritism. Its many colors, deep crimsons, brilliant blues, and threads of gold, flashed like a banner of distinction against the dusty browns of the pastoral landscape. For Joseph, the son of Jacob's old age, the coat was a daily reminder of his cherished status. For his 10 older brothers, it was a constant fluttering insult, a visual declaration that this dreamer was set apart, and they were not. The resentment simmered in their hearts, a slow-burning fire stoked by Joseph's own lack of discretion. He did not merely have dreams. He possessed visions of such staggering audacity that he felt compelled to share them. He spoke of sheaves of grain in a field where his brother's sheaves bowed down to his. He described the sun, moon, and 11 stars all rendering obeisance to him. The words, spoken with the unvarnished certainty of youth, were like sparks on dry tinder. The brothers could not speak a kind word to him. The dreams had erected a wall of bitter jealousy that grew higher with each passing day. The breaking point came when they saw the colorful coat approaching from a distance. They were far from home, tending the flocks near Dothan, away from their father's protective gaze. A conspiracy, born of envy and nurtured in isolation, hardened into a grim resolve. The initial plan was murder, to cast the dreamer into a pit and let the wilderness silence his grand visions forever. But Reuben the eldest intervened, suggesting they simply leave him in the empty cistern, a dark, dry hole in the earth, intending to rescue him later. They seized Joseph, their hands rough with fury, and stripped the beautiful coat from his shoulders. The symbol of his privilege was torn away, and he was lowered into the cold, lightless darkness. As he cried out from the pit, his pleas were met with the chilling sound of their indifference. They sat down to eat a meal. It was then that the caravan appeared on the horizon, a line of Ishmaelite merchants with their camels laden with spices, moving toward the markets of Egypt. A new, more profitable cruelty presented itself. Judah proposed they sell their brother. Why shed blood when they could be rid of him and profit from the transaction? The brothers agreed. They hauled Joseph from the pit, and for 20 shekels of silver, they sold their own flesh and blood into a life of bondage. They dipped the splendid coat in the blood of a slaughtered goat and presented it to their father. Jacob, upon seeing the torn, bloodied fabric, tore his own clothes and sank into a grief from which he would never fully emerge, mourning for days, convinced his beloved son had been torn to pieces by a wild beast. Meanwhile, Joseph was dragged in chains to Egypt, a slave in a foreign land. The pampered son was now property, his dreams seemingly buried in the sands of Canaan. Yet even in the house of his master Potiphar, the Lord was with him. Joseph found favor, and everything he did prospered, until he was placed in charge of the entire household. But this ascent was followed by another devastating fall, a false accusation that landed him in the king's prison. In the dungeon, however, the pattern repeated itself. The chief jailer saw that the Lord was with Joseph and put him in charge of all the prisoners. It was there that his God-given gift resurfaced. He accurately interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and baker, a talent that would eventually be his salvation. 2 years later, Pharaoh himself was troubled by dreams that none of his wise men could unravel. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 gaunt ones, 7 plump ears of grain swallowed by 7 thin and blighted ears. The restored cupbearer remembered the Hebrew prisoner. Joseph was hastily brought from the dungeon, shaved and given clean clothes, to stand before the most powerful man in the world. He made his allegiance clear. He could not interpret dreams, but God would give Pharaoh a favorable answer. He listened and then explained the divine warning. 7 years of unprecedented abundance were coming, followed by 7 years of a famine so severe it would consume the land. The dreams were doubled because the matter was fixed by God, and it would happen soon. Joseph did not stop at interpretation. He offered a plan. A discerning and wise man should be appointed to oversee the collection of 1/5 of the harvest during the plentiful years, storing the grain in cities as a reserve for the famine. Pharaoh saw the Spirit of God in this former slave and elevated him in an instant. He placed his own signet ring on Joseph's finger, dressed him in robes of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. Joseph, the dreamer sold into slavery, was now the governor of all Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. He oversaw the great storing, and the granaries of Egypt bulged with grain, a man-made mountain of provision against the coming despair. When the famine struck, it was severe over all the earth, but Egypt had bread. People from every nation came to Joseph to buy grain, and he opened the storehouses. The very dreams that had caused his betrayal now positioned him as the Savior of nations. The plan of God, hidden in the jealousy of brothers and the darkness of a pit, was now revealed in the light of day. The evil intended for him had been woven into a tapestry of salvation, a profound demonstration of a providence that could use even the worst of human actions to provide, to preserve, and to bring about an unimaginable good. Chapter 6. Moses and the burning bush. The wilderness of Midian was a vast, sun-scorched expanse of silence and stone, a place where a man could lose his past and bury his identity. For Moses, it had become a refuge, a 40-year penance for a life that had fractured in a single, violent moment. Once a prince of Egypt, adorned in linen and gold, he was now a shepherd, his hands calloused from the rough wood of his staff, his skin leathered by the relentless desert sun. The grand palaces of Memphis were a world away, replaced by the simple, wandering life of tending his father-in-law's flocks. He led the bleating sheep through arid valleys and up the flanks of Horeb, the mountain of God, a place that held a brooding ancient presence. Here, amidst the stark beauty of rock and sky, the memories of his people's cries from the brickyards of Egypt felt both distant and painfully close, a dull, persistent ache in his soul. It was on one such ordinary day, the heat shimmering in waves from the bare rock, that the extraordinary erupted into his world. His eyes, scanning the horizon for straying sheep, caught a flicker of light. A bush was on fire, its branches wreathed in brilliant dancing flames. Such a sight was not uncommon in the desert heat. But as he watched, a profound unease settled over him. Minutes passed, then an hour. The fire continued to burn with an undiminished ferocity, yet the bush itself was not consumed. No blackened branches curled and fell to ash. No smoke of burning wood filled the air. It stood, green and vibrant, clothed in a mantle of impossible fire. This was no natural phenomenon. This was a sign, a contradiction of every law he knew, and it demanded investigation. A holy curiosity, mixed with a deep, instinctive fear, drew him closer. As he stepped near, the voice came. It did not boom from the mountain peaks or rumble from the earth, but spoke from the very heart of the flames, a voice that was at once intimately close and awesomely other. Moses! Moses! The repetition of his name was a personal summons that pierced through 40 years of solitude. The command that followed was as simple as it was terrifying. Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. The act was one of profound reverence, a recognition that he stood in the immediate presence of the divine. This was no localized deity of the mountain, but the God of his fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At the sound of that identification, Moses hid his face, overcome with a fear that was not of punishment, but of sheer unveiled holiness. Then the voice declared its purpose, and the weight of centuries of suffering fell upon Moses' shoulders. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them. The God of the covenant had not been absent or indifferent. He had seen every lash of the whip, heard every groan of the enslaved, and stored every tear. And now the time for deliverance had come. The next words turned Moses' blood to ice. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. The proposal was ludicrous. The fugitive murderer, the failed prince, the 80-year-old shepherd, he was to stand before the most powerful man in the world and demand the release of a nation? A torrent of objections flooded his mind. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" he protested, his voice a whisper against the consuming fire. The answer was not a reassurance of his own ability, but a promise of divine presence. I will be with you. God offered a sign, not for Pharaoh, but for Moses himself, that on this very mountain he would one day worship with the freed nation. But Moses hesitated again, demanding a name to give to the Israelites. "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" From the bush came the profound, enigmatic reply, "I am who I am." It was a name of pure, self-existent being, the uncaused cause, the eternal present. The God who simply is was sending him. He was to tell them that I Am had sent him, the God of their fathers, the God of covenant faithfulness. Still, Moses resisted, pleading a lack of eloquence, a heavy tongue. The anger of the Lord kindled against his excuses, yet his compassion remained. "Who has made man's mouth? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak." As a final concession, God appointed his brother Aaron to be his spokesman. The call was inescapable. The burning bush, a symbol of God's powerful presence that sanctifies but does not destroy, had reframed Moses' entire existence. His past failures, his present obscurity, his perceived inadequacies, all were swept into the purposes of the great I Am. The shepherd was being sent back to the house of bondage, not as a prince, but as the humble instrument of a compassionate God, called to serve with a bravery he did not possess, but which would be supplied by the one who spoke from the fire. Chapter 7. The 10 Plagues of Egypt. The air in the throne room of Pharaoh was thick with the scent of incense and the weight of unyielding pride. Moses and Aaron stood before the gilded throne, their simple shepherd's staffs stark against the polished marble and glittering lapis lazuli. Their demand, delivered with a quiet authority that was not their own, echoed in the vast hall. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." A contemptuous smile touched Pharaoh's lips. Who was this Lord, that he should command obedience from the ruler of the Nile, the son of Ra? His heart, fortified by centuries of divine kingship and the adoration of 1,000,000 subjects, hardened like granite. The God of slaves would not dictate terms to the master of Egypt. The refusal was swift and absolute, and with it the first delicate thread of mercy was severed. The confrontation was no longer a request. It was the opening salvo in a divine war against the pantheon of false powers that held a nation captive. The judgment began at the river, the lifeblood of Egypt, and the seat of its chief god, Hapi. Aaron, at Moses' word, stretched his staff over the sacred waters. The current did not merely slow or darken, it transformed. From the great delta to the upstream cataracts, the Nile turned to blood, a thick, clotting crimson that choked the life from the river. The fish, symbols of fertility and sustenance, died in their millions, their silver bellies turning up to foul the surface. The water in the jars and canals turned to blood, and a stench of death rose from the banks where Egyptians could no longer drink. For 7 days the land gasped in thirst, while the magicians of Pharaoh, with their dark arts, mimicked the feat on a small scale, a pathetic parlor trick that only served to mock the true scope of the calamity. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained unmoved, and he turned away, retreating into his palace as if he could ignore the reeking evidence of a power greater than his own. After the blood came the frogs. At another command, Aaron's staff pointed once more toward the water, and the river, still running red, gave up a new horror, a croaking, living tide of frogs swarmed up the banks, an unstoppable, leaping deluge of green and brown. They infiltrated every space, sacred and profane. They filled the ovens and the kneading bowls, their slick bodies squirming in the bread dough. They piled up in heaps in the bedrooms, their cold skin touching the sleeping Pharaoh in his own bed. They hopped through the temples, defiling the altars of the gods. The land was a cacophony of their grating chorus, a plague upon the goddess Hecht, who was depicted with the head of a frog. This time, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron, begging for the removal of the frogs and promising to let the people go. But the moment the air cleared of their stinking piled carcasses, he reneged, his momentary distress forgotten, his heart calcifying further. Then came the gnats. Without a staff, without a river to strike, Moses simply directed Aaron to strike the dust of the earth. The very ground, the substance of Geb, the earth god stirred and rose as a cloud of fine biting dust, a seething mass of gnats that settled on man and beast alike. There was no escaping them. They crawled in eyes, ears, and nostrils, a maddening, constant irritation. The Egyptian magicians, trying to replicate this, failed utterly. They fell back, declaring to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." It was a confession of defeat from his own wise men, an acknowledgment of a power their sorcery could not touch. But Pharaoh would not listen. His pride had become a fortress, and he would not surrender. The fourth plague brought swarms of flies, a dense, buzzing darkness that blotted out the sun. They were not the common flies of the market, but a vicious, relentless horde that ruined the land. Yet, in this plague, a profound distinction was made. The region of Goshen, where the Israelites dwelt, remained untouched. Not a single fly buzzed in their streets or settled on their animals. In the heart of Egypt, there was a protected people, a clear line drawn by the hand of their God. Pharaoh, seeing this division, offered a compromise. They could sacrifice to their God, but they must do it within the land of Egypt. Moses refused. Their sacrifices would be an abomination to the Egyptians, who would stone them. They must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. For a moment, Pharaoh relented, only to harden his heart once more the instant the flies were gone, trapping the Israelites in a cycle of hope and despair. Each plague was a precise surgical strike against the Egyptian pantheon, a demonstration that the Lord held dominion over every sphere they claimed to rule. The plague on the livestock struck at Hathor, the cow-headed goddess, and Apis, the bull god, killing the herds of the Egyptians while leaving the livestock of Israel healthy and whole. The boils that broke out on man and beast, inflicted by soot from a furnace tossed toward the sky, were a blight upon the healers, Imhotep and Sekhmet. The hail, mixed with fire, shattered trees and flax and barley, a direct challenge to Nut, the sky goddess, and Seth, the god of storms. The locusts, an east wind-driven living blanket of consumption, devoured everything the hail had left, mocking the god of crops, Osiris. The deep, oppressive darkness that could be felt, a darkness so thick it smothered lamps and extinguished the sun itself for 3 days, was a definitive victory over Ra, the supreme sun god. In the land of the Egyptians, no one could see or move, but in Goshen, the Israelites had light in their dwellings. Through it all, a divine patience was on display. Before many of the later plagues, Moses stood before Pharaoh delivering the warning, giving him a chance to repent, to humble himself. "How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me?" was the repeated, sorrowful question from the God who desired mercy, not judgment. Each time, Pharaoh's heart grew heavier, more resistant. He bargained, he lied, he promised, and recanted. His own officials began to plead with him, seeing their nation being systematically dismantled. "Do you not yet understand that Egypt is ruined?" they cried. But the king's will, now a tool in a larger cosmic struggle, was unyielding. The plagues were not merely punishments. They were object lessons in the absolute sovereignty of the God of Israel, a relentless unveiling of his might over every false power, and a breathtaking display of his patience, giving chance after chance for a stubborn king to bend his knee before the final, terrible blow would fall. Chapter 8. The Passover night, a dreadful silence fell over Egypt, a stillness more terrifying than any of the plagues that had preceded it. The word had gone out, passed in hushed, trembling tones from Hebrew household to Hebrew household. The final, unthinkable judgment was at hand. After the Nile's blood, the swarms of frogs, the gnats and flies, the pestilence, the boils, the hail, the locusts, and the suffocating darkness, the 10th and most terrible act was imminent. The angel of death was coming, and no firstborn son from the heir to the throne to the lowliest slave girl's child would be spared. But for the Israelites, huddled in their homes in the land of Goshen, there was a command that carried the weight of salvation, a set of precise, urgent instructions that formed a narrow bridge over the chasm of judgment. The center of this divine ritual was a lamb. Each family was to select one, a male without blemish, a perfect, innocent life. For 4 days the lamb lived with the family, a quiet, living reminder of the sacrifice to come. Then, as the sun began to set on the 14th day of the month, the lambs were slaughtered at a designated time, their blood caught in basins. The atmosphere was thick with a somber reverence, the bleating silenced, the act itself a profound and sobering symbol of substitution. Then, with a bunch of hyssop, a common humble plant, the father of each household dipped into the blood and applied it to the 2 doorposts and lintel of his home. The crimson marks stood out starkly against the mud, brick, and wood, a bold, defiant sign of faith in the Word of God. It was not the quality of the home or the righteousness of its inhabitants that would provide safety, but the blood of the Lamb, publicly displayed. Inside, under the sign of the blood, there was safety. Outside, there was only the coming horror. Inside those marked homes, a strange and hurried meal was prepared. The lamb was roasted whole, not a bone broken, its savory aroma filling the confined spaces. It was to be eaten with unleavened bread, dough prepared without yeast and baked quickly over the fire, their flat, plain form a symbol of both purity and haste. Bitter herbs were served alongside, their sharp, acrid taste a poignant reminder of the bitterness of their centuries of slavery. The people were to eat dressed for travel, their cloaks tucked into their belts, their sandals on their feet, their staffs in their hands. Every detail spoke of a moment poised on a knife's edge between captivity and freedom, between death and life. They ate in solemn anticipation, their ears straining for any sound from the streets, their hearts a turbulent mix of fear for the judgment outside and a desperate burgeoning hope for the deliverance promised. Then, at the stroke of midnight, it came. A wave of divine judgment swept through the land of Egypt unseen but felt in its terrible effect. It was not a plague of disease or a swarm of insects, but a direct, personal visitation. A great cry went up, a sound of anguish so profound and universal that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. In every Egyptian home, from the grandest palace chamber to the most humble mud hut, the firstborn son lay dead. Pharaoh's own heir, the future god-king, was slain. The cattle in the fields, the firstborn of the beasts, also fell. There was no home where there was not someone dead. The wails of grief and horror rose into the night, a symphony of despair that testified to the absolute and final nature of God's judgment on the gods and the pride of Egypt. But in the homes of the Israelites, behind the doors marked with blood, there was not a sound of grief. The angel of the Lord passed over them. The destroyer saw the blood and did not enter. The sign of the Lamb was honored. Inside, families huddled together, hearing the cacophony of mourning from the city, their own hearts pounding with a terrified awe. The blood on their door frames was not just paint. It was a shield, a covenant of protection. In that darkest of nights, they experienced a miracle of discrimination, salvation not based on their ethnicity or their good works, but on their obedience to the provision God had made. They were saved because they trusted in the blood of the Lamb. Before the night was over, a frantic summons came from the palace. Pharaoh, broken by the death of his son and the weight of the cumulative plagues, sent for Moses and Aaron. "Up, go out from among my people," he commanded, his voice stripped of all its former arrogance, trembling with loss and fear. "Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone." The Egyptians, themselves gripped by a terror of the God of the Hebrews, urged them to leave, pressing jewelry and articles of silver and gold into their hands, desperate to be rid of them and the divine power that protected them. The Israelites, who had entered Egypt as a family of 70, now left as a great multitude, a nation in the making, enriched by the spoils of their former masters. They moved quickly, a vast, organized throng flowing out of the city of Ramesses and into the wilderness, the unleavened dough on their backs not yet risen. The night of terror was behind them. The road to freedom stretched ahead. The Passover was not merely an event, it was an institution, a permanent memorial. They were commanded to observe this night throughout all their generations, to tell their children the story of how the Lord had passed over their homes when he struck the Egyptians, how he had brought them out with a mighty hand. It was the ultimate story of God's protection and salvation, a vivid, eternal picture of redemption purchased by the blood of a substitute, a testament to the grace that liberates his people from the slavery of sin and the judgment they rightly deserve. Chapter 9. Parting the Red Sea. The taste of freedom was still fresh on their lips, a heady, exhilarating draught after the bitter wine of centuries in bondage. But the wilderness, a vast and trackless expanse of sand and stone, offered no sanctuary. The thunder that began as a distant rumble soon grew into a terrifying, earth-shaking roar. Not a storm from the heavens, but the sound of an empire's wrath on the move. Chariots, hundreds upon hundreds of them, their bronze fittings glinting like malevolent eyes in the sun, churned across the desert floor. Pharaoh, his grief over his dead son curdled into a cold, calculating rage, had marshaled his entire army. The might of Egypt was bearing down upon them a wall of dust and iron and vengeance, closing the door on their escape with terrifying speed. Panic, sharp and acrid, swept through the Israelite camp. They were trapped, utterly and completely. Before them stretched the great sea, a seemingly endless barrier of churning, deep blue water. Behind them, the horizon was blotted out by the approaching war machine. The cries that had once risen to God from the brickyards of Egypt now rose from the shores of the sea. But these were cries of accusation and despair. They turned on Moses, their voices a ragged chorus of fear. "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness?" The memory of their slavery, with all its brutality, suddenly seemed preferable to the imminent violent death that now faced them. Freedom had been a fleeting dream, and the waking reality was a nightmare of certain destruction. Moses stood before the terrified multitude, his own heart likely pounding against his ribs. But his voice, when he spoke, was a steady anchor in the storm of their fear. "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." The words were a monumental act of faith, a declaration that defied the evidence of their eyes. He turned from the people and lifted his face and his hands toward heaven, his staff clenched in his grip. His prayer was not a plea for a new miracle, but a cry for the fulfillment of a promise already given. Then came the command, a divine interruption to his prayer. "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward." The instruction was as impossible as it was clear. Forward meant into the sea. Then God told Moses to lift his staff and stretch out his hand over the water. The weathered wood of the shepherd's staff, the same one that had struck the Nile and summoned the plagues, was now raised over the final, insurmountable obstacle. As Moses obeyed, a powerful east wind began to blow, a gale sent from the very breath of God. It was not a gentle breeze, but a roaring, sustained force that tore at their clothes and whipped the sand into stinging clouds. All night long that wind blew upon the sea, and the impossible began to happen. The waters did not merely recede, they were pushed back, heaped up on either side as if by invisible, colossal hands. The seabed was laid bare, not as a muddy, sucking bog, but as dry ground, a path of hard-packed sand and clay through the heart of the deep. Walls of water, shimmering, translucent, and terrifyingly tall, stood frozen on their left and on their right, held in place by a power that defied every law of nature. The sea had become a corridor, and the way of escape was open. With a sense of awe that momentarily eclipsed their fear, the people began to move. A nation of over 1,000,000 souls, with their flocks and herds, stepped onto the floor of the sea. The path was wide, allowing them to move as a great host, but the journey was one of heart-pounding tension. The towering walls of water, gleaming in the light of the pillar of fire that had moved behind them to hold the Egyptians at bay, loomed over them, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of their salvation. The only sound was the muffled roar of the wind and the shuffle of countless feet on the strange new earth. They walked in the midst of a miracle, a people passing through the very jaws of death, shielded by nothing but the command of their God. As the last of the Israelites reached the far shore, the Egyptians, blinded by fury and pride, charged onto the path. Their chariot wheels, designed for the desert, churned and slipped on the damp sea floor, slowing their pursuit. In the pre-dawn gloom, confusion spread through their ranks. From the pillar of fire the Lord looked down and threw the Egyptian army into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels and turning their advance into a chaotic jumble. The realization of their peril dawned too late. "Let us flee from before Israel," they cried, "for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians." It was then that the command came again to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians." Moses raised his staff once more, and as the morning sun broke over the eastern hills, the supernatural wind ceased. The suspended walls of water, their divine constraint released, collapsed with a cataclysmic roar. The sea rushed back into its place with an overwhelming, irresistible force. The Egyptian army, with all its chariots and horsemen, was engulfed. The mighty war chariots of Pharaoh were tossed like toys in the surging tide. The finest soldiers in the world drowned in the very waters they had thought would be their ally. Not a single one of them remained. On the safe shore, the Israelites watched, their mouths agape at the totality of the destruction. The sea was once again a calm blue expanse, its surface unmarred, hiding the grave of their oppressors. The silence that followed was broken by a single voice, then another, until the entire multitude erupted into a spontaneous, thunderous song of praise. Moses led them in a hymn of triumph, declaring the greatness and power of their deliverer. Then his sister Miriam, a prophetess, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with dancing and song. "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." The song was one of pure, unadulterated joy and worship, the sound of a people who had passed from certain death into undeniable life, their faith forged in the fire of crisis and sealed by the most mighty deliverance. They had been rescued not from a difficult situation, but from an impossible one, and the memory of the parted sea would forever be etched in their identity as the definitive proof of their God's power to save. Chapter 10. Manna from Heaven. The euphoria of the Red Sea's deliverance faded like a desert mirage, replaced by the grim, unyielding reality of the wilderness. For weeks, the vast multitude of Israelites trekked through the barren expanse, the sun a merciless brass eye in a sky of bleached blue. The fine, choking dust of the desert coated their throats and filled their nostrils, a constant, gritty reminder of their vulnerability. Their sandals wore thin on the sharp stones, and their stomachs, once filled with the leeks and onions of Egypt, now clenched with a hollow, gnawing ache. The memory of their slavery began to warp in their minds, the cruelty of the taskmasters softened by the phantom taste of a full pot of meat. A low grumble started among the people, a restless murmur that grew with each hungry mile, swelling into a chorus of complaint directed at Moses and Aaron. They accused their leaders of bringing them into the wilderness to starve, their faith in the God who had drowned Pharaoh's army evaporating under the heat of immediate need. In the quiet of his tent, Moses heard the discontent and carried it, a heavy burden, before the Lord. The response was not one of rebuke for their lack of faith, but a promise of breathtaking compassion. God told Moses that he had heard the grumbling of the people and would rain bread from heaven for them. Each day they would go out and gather enough for that day alone, a daily test of their trust. On the 6th day they were to gather a double portion, For the seventh day was a sacred Sabbath of rest. The provision would be a tangible lesson in dependence, a divine antidote to their anxiety. The next morning, as the first hint of dawn painted the eastern horizon, a strange phenomenon occurred. The dew that settled on the camp lifted, and there, left upon the surface of the desert like a delicate frost, was a fine, flaky substance. It was as fine as hoar frost on the ground, a delicate coriander seed white covering that crunched softly underfoot. The people saw it and asked one another, "What is it?" The word manna stuck, a name born of wonder and confusion. Moses explained that this was the bread the Lord had given them to eat. The instructions were simple. Each person was to gather an omer, just enough for one day's sustenance for their household. They were to trust that tomorrow would bring a new provision. The manna itself was a marvel. It was like coriander seed, white, and its taste was like wafers made with honey, a sweet, nourishing sustenance that satisfied both hunger and a longing for comfort. The people went out and gathered, some taking more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever had gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever had gathered little had no lack. A miraculous economy was at work, ensuring each family had exactly what it needed, no more and no less. It was a direct, daily intervention that rendered hoarding pointless and taught a radical reliance on the giver, not the gift. Yet, the lesson was a difficult one for hearts schooled in scarcity and self-preservation. Despite the clear command, some of the people, driven by a deep-seated fear of tomorrow's emptiness, tried to save a portion of their manna until morning. But by sunrise, the hoarded manna was spoiled, full of writhing maggots and stinking with rot. The sight and smell of their faithless hoarding was a potent object lesson. The provision was daily, and it could not be stockpiled against God's faithfulness. They were learning, through failure and grace, that their security lay not in their own storehouses, but in the faithful character of their provider, who commanded the dawn. The rhythm of trust was further established with the approach of the Sabbath. On the sixth day, the people gathered a double portion of manna, and this time Moses assured them it would not spoil. They were to bake or boil what they needed and set aside the rest for the day of rest. The next morning, the preserved manna remained sweet and edible, a quiet miracle confirming the sanctity of the Sabbath. When some of the people went out to gather on the seventh day, despite the clear instruction, they found the ground bare. The Lord's question to Moses was gentle but firm. How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? The empty landscape was its own sermon, teaching that true rest comes from trusting God to provide even when one is not actively laboring to secure one's own needs. For 40 years, as they journeyed through the wilderness, the manna continued to fall with the dawn. It ceased only when they crossed into the promised land and ate the produce of Canaan. But for that generation, the delicate, honey-tasted flakes were more than mere sustenance. They were a daily sacrament, a physical manifestation of God's unwavering faithfulness. Each morning's gathering was an act of faith, a small obedience that reinforced a monumental truth. Their lives were upheld not by their own foresight or strength, but by the gracious, reliable hand of a God who cared for their daily bread, teaching them to live not in anxious accumulation, but in thankful, moment-by-moment dependence. Chapter 11. Water from the Rock. The wilderness was a crucible of thirst, a landscape where hope evaporated faster than the morning dew. The Israelites' journey from the Red Sea had led them deeper into the sun-bleached desolation of the desert of sin, and now to a place called Rephidim, a name that would become synonymous with testing and contention. Here, the stark reality of their situation pressed in upon them with a suffocating weight. The waterskins, filled days earlier from a brackish spring, were now limp and empty. The children's cries were no longer for bread, but for water, their small voices raspy and weak. The adults' lips cracked, and their tongues felt thick and heavy in their mouths. The euphoric memory of the parted sea and the daily miracle of manna seemed like cruel taunts in the face of this new, more primal need. A desperate, fearful anger began to boil within the camp, turning from internal grumbling to direct, venomous confrontation. They converged on Moses, their faces etched with panic and accusation. The crowd was a seething mass of desperation, their demands sharp and pointed. "Give us water to drink," they shouted. The question they hurled at him was not a plea, but an indictment. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" The accusation cut deeper than their previous complaints about food. It questioned the very motive of their deliverance, painting their exodus not as a rescue, but as a divinely orchestrated death sentence in the desert. Their faith, so recently bolstered by visible miracles, shattered like a dry clay pot against the hard rock of their immediate physical suffering. They were so enraged that Moses feared they were on the verge of stoning him, their leader becoming the scapegoat for their terror. In the midst of this volatile chaos, Moses did what he had learned to do. He turned from the angry faces and cried out to the Lord. His prayer was not long, but it was freighted with the gravity of the moment. "What shall I do with this people?" he pleaded. "They are almost ready to stone me." He stood as a lone mediator between a terrified multitude and the silent, searing sky, his own spirit parched and weary. The answer from God was immediate and direct, a clear command in the confusion. He instructed Moses to take the staff, the same staff that had struck the Nile and parted the sea, and walk on ahead of the people, taking some of the elders of Israel as witnesses. His destination was a specific rock at Horeb, the mountain of God. There, God promised, he would stand before Moses on the rock. The solution was not to be found in a newly discovered oasis or a sudden rainstorm, but in the most unlikely of places, a solid, unyielding face of stone. Moses, with the elders trailing behind him in a tense, silent procession, made his way to the designated rock. It was a massive outcropping of granite baked by the sun, its surface seamed and ancient. It stood as a symbol of permanence and barrenness, the last place one would look for life-giving water. The people watched from a distance, their murmuring hushed by a mixture of skepticism and a faint, desperate hope. Then, following the divine command, Moses raised the weathered staff high above his head. The muscles in his arm corded with the effort, and with a cry that was part obedience and part pent-up frustration, he brought the rod down upon the rock. The sound of wood striking stone echoed sharply across the canyon, a dry, hopeless sound, but the echo was swallowed by a new, impossible noise. A deep, groaning rumble issued from within the rock itself, as if the heart of the mountain were breaking. Then, from the very spot where the staff had struck, A fissure appeared, not a trickle, not a seep, but a roaring, explosive torrent of water burst forth. It was a liquid explosion, a geyser of pure, clear water that gushed out with unbelievable force and abundance. It did not merely flow, it cascaded down the face of the rock, carving a new channel in the dust, a rushing, life-giving river, where moments before there had been only dust and despair. The sound was that of a mighty waterfall, a glorious, thunderous answer to the silent prayers and angry demands. A wave of stunned disbelief, followed by rapturous joy, swept through the camp. The people surged forward, not in anger now, but in desperate, grateful haste. They fell to their knees at the water's edge, cupping their hands and drinking deeply the cool, clear liquid. Aye, balm to their cracked lips and parched throats. They filled their water skins until they bulged, splashed the water over their heated faces, and watched as their children and animals drank their fill. The water flowed on, an unending, generous stream that provided more than enough for the entire multitude and all their livestock. It was a miracle of sheer, extravagant grace, a provision that met their physical need in a way that was both dramatic and deeply compassionate. In the aftermath, Moses named the place Massa and Meribah, which mean testing and quarreling, a permanent memorial to the people's failure to trust and their contention against God. But the names also stood as a testament to God's response. He had not punished their faithlessness by withholding water. He had answered their desperate need with overwhelming generosity. The water from the rock was more than a physical sustenance. It was a profound revelation of God's character. It demonstrated that His compassion flows even when faith fails, that He responds to the cry of need, and that His provision can spring from the most barren and unlikely places. The staff that had brought judgment upon Egypt had now, striking a rock in the wilderness, unleashed a river of mercy, proving once again that the God who led them was a God who saw their suffering and, in His own time and way, abundantly answered. Chapter 12. The 10 Commandments. The mountain trembled as if the very foundations of the earth were groaning under a weight too glorious to bear. For 3 days a thick, brooding darkness had cloaked Mount Sinai, pierced only by flashes of lightning that revealed the peak wreathed in a raging divine fire. The air itself crackled with a holy charge, and the sound of a shofar, not blown by human lips, grew louder and louder until it was a terrifying, unending blast that tore at the soul. Below, the vast Israelite camp stood hushed and trembling, a sea of upturned, fearful faces illuminated by the unearthly glow from above. They had washed their clothes and consecrated themselves as commanded, but nothing could have prepared them for the visceral, overwhelming reality of God's descent. This was not the gentle guidance of a pillar of cloud. This was the raw, untamed presence of the King of the universe, and the boundary set at the mountain's base felt terrifyingly fragile. The people stood at a distance, their hearts pounding in their chests, while Moses alone ascended into the terrifying gloom, a solitary figure moving toward the heart of the storm. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses remained on the mountain, enveloped in the consuming fire. The Israelites below saw only the terrifying spectacle, the smoke rising like the smoke of a furnace, the whole mountain quaking violently, the relentless trumpet blast. But on the summit, beyond the veil of nature's fury, a profound and intimate transaction was taking place. There, In the core of the tempest, God spoke to Moses, not in thunder, but with the clarity of relationship. He was defining the terms of his covenant, not as a distant dictator, but as a loving father establishing a household for his redeemed children. The laws he gave were the architecture for a new society, the moral and spiritual DNA for a people set apart to reflect his character to the world. At the heart of this divine constitution were 10 foundational words, etched by the very finger of God into tablets of stone, a permanent, unyielding testament to his will. The first commandments carved into the stone were vertical, defining the relationship between God and his people. You shall have no other gods before me. In a world teeming with idols and regional deities, this was a radical declaration of exclusive allegiance. The God who had brought them out of Egypt with a mighty hand demanded their undivided worship. This was followed by the prohibition against graven images, a safeguard against reducing the infinite, invisible God to a manageable object of wood or metal. His name was to be held in reverence, not used lightly or for vain purposes. And the Sabbath day was to be remembered and kept holy, a weekly sanctuary in time, a perpetual reminder that their identity was found not in their labor, but in their rest in Him. These laws established the proper order of the universe, God first and everything else in its rightful place beneath Him. The second set of commandments turned the gaze horizontally, outlining the sacred geometry of human community. Honor your father and your mother, the stone declared, anchoring society in the bedrock of the family and ensuring the transmission of covenant faithfulness from one generation to the next. Then came the stark, simple prohibitions that protected the sanctity of life, marriage, and property. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. Each law was a bulwark against the chaos that had consumed the pre-flood world and the oppression they had known in Egypt. They were commandments for a free people, designed to cultivate a community where trust could flourish and life could be lived without fear. The final injunctions protected truth and contentment. You shall not bear false witness, ensuring justice could be built on a foundation of honesty, and you shall not covet, striking at the root of all sin by addressing the disordered desires of the human heart. When Moses finally descended the mountain, the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, his face shone with a reflected glory so radiant that the people could not look directly at him. He had been in the presence of the divine, and the encounter had left a physical mark. He assembled the people and relayed to them all the words of the Lord and all the rules. The response was a unified, solemn vow. All the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. It was a moment of high commitment, a national pledge of obedience. The covenant was sealed with the blood of sacrificed animals, sprinkled on the altar and on the people, a graphic symbol that their life as a nation was now bound to the faithfulness of their God. The 10 Commandments were far more than a list of restrictions. They were a gift of profound love. They were the guidance of a caring God for a good life, the boundaries that would keep His people safe, free, and in a right relationship with Him and with each other. In a world of moral confusion, they provided clarity. For a people newly liberated from slavery, they charted the path to a different kind of freedom, the freedom that comes from living in harmony with the Creator's design. The thunder and smoke of Sinai would fade, but the words etched in stone would endure, an eternal expression of God's covenant love and his desire for a people who would be his treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Chapter 13, The Walls of Jericho. Fall. The city of Jericho was a fortress of fear, its massive stone walls a seemingly unbreachable declaration of defiance against the advancing tide of Israel. For generations its foundations had withstood sieges in time, a bastion of Canaanite power that now loomed over the plains like a clenched fist, its gates shut tight and its inhabitants watching from the ramparts with a mixture of contempt and dread. They had heard the stories of the God who dried up the Red Sea and toppled kings, and a cold terror had gripped their hearts. Inside her house, embedded within the great wall, Rahab waited, the scarlet cord a silent, desperate prayer in her window, a testament to a faith born from hearing of a power greater than any stone or mortar. For the Israelites camped beyond, the city was more than a military objective. It was the first fruit of the promised land, a test of their willingness to follow a God whose strategies defied all human logic. The command that came to Joshua was as bizarre as it was specific. There were to be no siege engines constructed, no battering rams built, no tunnels dug. The battle plan was one of silent, patient procession. The armed men were to march around the city once a day for 6 days, followed by 7 priests blowing trumpets of ram's horns, the Ark of the Covenant carried in their midst as a visible symbol of the invisible King leading the campaign. The only sound was to be the mournful, echoing blasts of the shofars and the rhythmic tread of thousands of sandaled feet on the hard-packed earth. On the first day, as the sun rose, the procession began. The people moved in a solemn, silent column, their eyes fixed on the walls where enemy soldiers stood watching, their jeers and taunts falling on ears disciplined to obedience. The circuit completed, they returned to their camp, the walls of Jericho standing as immovable as ever, the silence of the Israelite host more unnerving than any battle cry. For 6 days, the strange ritual repeated itself. At the same time, each morning, the procession formed, a silent, coiling serpent winding its way around the stone bulwarks. The inhabitants of Jericho grew increasingly unnerved. The expected assault never came. There was only the disquieting sight of a nation on parade and the haunting, persistent sound of the trumpets. Inside the Israelite camp, faith was being forged in the fire of obedience. To march in silence day after day with no visible result required a trust that looked beyond the imposing physical reality to the promise of the God who had spoken. It was a test of patience, a lesson in the truth that victory often comes through ways that seem foolish to the wisdom of the world. Then came the dawn of the 7th day. This day was different. The command was to march not once, but 7 times around the city. The air was electric with anticipation as the people rose in the pre-dawn darkness. As the sun's first rays touched the highest stones of Jericho's walls, the procession began its first circuit. The silence was deeper, more intense, the only sound the shuffling of feet and the 7-fold blast of the horns. They completed the first circle, then the second, then the third. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the marchers. The 4th circuit, the 5th, the 6th, still the wall stood, silent and mocking. The tension was a physical weight. Then, on the 7th circuit, as the priests blew a long, sustained blast on the trumpets, Joshua's voice rang out, strong and clear, breaking the week-long silence. "Shout," he commanded the people, "for the Lord has given you the city." A roar erupted from the throats of the entire nation, a colossal, unified cry of faith and triumph that seemed to shake the very air. It was not a cry of human strength, but a declaration of trust in the power of their God. At the sound of the shout, as the trumpets continued their deafening blast, the impossible happened. A deep, grinding rumble emanated from the foundations of Jericho. The massive stones of the great wall began to shudder, then to shift. Cracks appeared, zigzagging up the fortified face like lightning. With a sound like 1,000 thunders, the entire wall buckled inward, the stones tearing away from their mortar and crashing down in a cataclysmic avalanche of dust and rubble. The formidable defense of Jericho collapsed in an instant, not from the outside in, but from the ground up, as if an unseen hand had simply pushed it over. The way into the city was laid open, not a single section left standing except for one small portion, the wall that contained Rahab's house, where the scarlet cord hung. The armed men of Israel charged straight in, every man straight ahead, over the fallen stones and into the heart of the city that had once seemed impregnable. The victory was swift and total, a divine judgment executed upon a culture steeped in idolatry and wickedness. And in the midst of the conquest, the promise was kept. Joshua had given orders to the 2 spies, and they fought their way to the one section of wall that remained miraculously intact. They brought out Rahab and her father, mother, brothers, and all who belonged to her, delivering them to safety outside the camp of Israel. The prostitute who had feared the God of heaven was saved, her faith honored, her life and the lives of her family spared, and she would go on to find a place in the very lineage of the Messiah. The dust settled over the ruins of Jericho, the silence returning, now profound and complete. The people looked upon the heap of shattered stone that had once been a symbol of invincibility. The victory was undeniably the Lord's. No Israelite sword had struck the wall. No human strategy had devised its fall. The power that had spoken the world into being had, with a shout and a trumpet blast, reduced a fortress to rubble. The fall of Jericho was a stunning lesson in the nature of God's power in battle, a power that is released not through conventional might, but through the unwavering faith and obedient footsteps of a people willing to follow His unusual and often perplexing plans. The first city in the Promised Land was taken not by their strength, but by their surrender to a divine strategy, establishing a precedent that would echo through all their future battles. The battle is the Lord's. Chapter 14. Samson's Great Strength. The Spirit of the Lord was a restless fire, a coiled spring of divine power, waiting for a vessel through which to unleash its fury. That vessel was a man named Samson, a Nazirite set apart from the womb, his life consecrated by vows that marked him as God's own weapon against the oppressive Philistine fist that gripped Israel. His long, uncut hair was the outward sign of an inward dedication, the physical token of a supernatural strength that did not reside in the bulk of his muscles, but in the favor of his God. He was a paradox, a man of divine purpose, yet driven by the passions of his own heart, a solitary champion walking the contested borderlands between Dan and Philistia, where every encounter was a potential spark for the conflict simmering just beneath the surface of his life. That spark came on the rugged road down to Timnah. A young lion, its tawny coat rippling over powerful shoulders, emerged from the scrub with a low, challenging growl, its eyes fixed on the lone traveler. The air itself seemed to still, the only sound the beast's rumbling breath and the whisper of the dry grass. There were no weapons in Samson's hands, no companions at his back. But as the lion roared and charged, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him with a terrifying, tangible force. It was not a surge of adrenaline, but a divine empowerment that coursed through his limbs. He met the charge barehanded, his hands finding the beast's mighty jaws. With a strength that was not his own, he seized the lion and tore it apart as if it were a young goat. The sound of rending flesh and cracking bone was horrifying, a brutal display of power that left the carcass lying in two bloody pieces on the path. He walked away, his hands stained, the secret of his strength a quiet, humming truth within him, a testament to the raw power of God working through a dedicated man. Later, passing the same spot, he found a swarm of bees had made a hive in the lion's dried carcass, honey glistening in the hollow of its ribs. It was a picture of life from death, sweetness from strength, a paradox that would come to define his own tumultuous story. He scooped the honey into his hands, eating as he went, and offered it to his perplexed parents. The origin of the sweetness, a riddle he chose to keep. That riddle, born from the lion and the honey, would become the catalyst for his first open confrontation with the Philistines, a confrontation he won through the same spirit-empowered fury, striking down 30 of their men to pay a debt. It was the beginning of his long personal war, a deliverance wrought not through the strategy of armies, but through the explosive, targeted acts of a single, empowered individual. For 20 years, Samson judged Israel, a one-man insurgency against Philistine dominance. His strength became the stuff of legend and terror. When the men of Gaza tried to ambush him at the city gate, he arose at midnight, took the massive doors of the gate, along with the 2 posts and bar, and carried them on his shoulders to the top of a hill facing Hebron, a mocking, impossible feat of strength. When the Philistines demanded his capture, and the men of Judah bound him with new ropes to hand him over, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him once more. The ropes on his arms became like burnt flax, and the bonds fell from his hands. Seizing the fresh jawbone of a donkey, he wielded it with devastating effect, striking down 1,000 men, the bone itself a humble, unlikely instrument of divine judgment. He stood amidst the carnage, a solitary figure of deliverance, and his triumphant cry echoed the truth of his mission. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have struck down 1,000 men. Yet the very strength that made him a public deliverer was tethered to a private vulnerability. His heart, for all its power, was susceptible to the allure of Philistine women, a fatal flaw that would lead him into the web of Delilah. In her soft embrace, and with her persistent, wheedling questions, the secret of his strength was slowly, tragically, unraveled. "If I'm shaved," he confessed at last, his spirit worn down by her nagging, "then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man." It was a betrayal of his Nazirite vow, a surrender of the token of his dedication. As he slept with his head in her lap, the Philistine lord she had summoned sheared off the 7 locks of his hair. The power that had torn apart lions and toppled armies departed from him, and he awoke to the harsh reality of his own weakness, the chilling words, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson," now a sentence of capture and humiliation. They gouged out his eyes, the man who had seen and slain so many, and bound him with bronze shackles in their prison at Gaza. There, pushing a grindstone in endless blind circles, his hair began to grow back. It was a quiet, unnoticed sign of a potential restoration, a symbol of a dedication that, though broken, could be renewed. Brought out to entertain the Philistine lords in the temple of Dagon, he stood between the two central pillars, his hands resting on the cool, carved stone. In that moment of ultimate humiliation, he prayed one last, desperate prayer. "O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once, O God." It was a plea for a final act of deliverance, not for his own life, but for vengeance upon the enemies of God. The prayer was answered. The old, familiar power surged through his atrophied muscles one final time. He braced himself between the pillars and pushed with all his might, his cry a roar of faith and fury. The great temple groaned, the pillars shifted, and with a deafening crash, the roof and walls collapsed upon the thousands gathered inside, killing more in his death than he had in his life. In that final cataclysmic act, the theme of his story was sealed. God's power, which had worked so mightily through a dedicated man, was ultimately his to give and to use for his own purposes of justice. Even Samson's pride and failure were woven into a tapestry of divine judgment, proving that God's strength is made perfect not in human perfection, but in vessels who, for all their flaws, are ultimately set apart for Him. Chapter 15, David and Goliath. The valley of Elah was a stage set for a war of attrition, a sun-baked corridor of tension where two armies faced each other across a dry riverbed, their battle lines drawn like the teeth of opposing saws. For 40 days, the stalemate had been broken not by the clash of armies, but by a single, monstrous figure who emerged each morning and evening to bellow his challenge across the divide. Goliath of Gath was a giant, a warrior whose height cast a long, chilling shadow, his body encased in a scaled coat of bronze that weighed more than a full-grown man. The bronze helmet on his head, the greaves on his legs, and the javelin slung across his back were the panoply of a walking fortress. In his hand he held a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam, its iron head a promise of instant crushing death. His voice, when he roared, was a physical force that seemed to vibrate in the chests of the Israelite soldiers. "Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me," he would thunder, his words dripping with contempt. "If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants." The challenge was a throwback to an older form of combat, a duel of champions that would decide the fate of thousands. And with each repetition, the spirit of King Saul and all his army withered, drained away by a tide of collective, shameful fear. Into this atmosphere of paralyzed dread came a young shepherd named David, sent by his father Jesse with provisions for his 3 eldest brothers who served in Saul's army. He arrived as the armies were drawing up their battle lines, the familiar grating taunt of the Philistine champion echoing once more across the valley. David saw the Israelite soldiers, hardened veterans, shrink back and flee from the giant in terror. He heard their whispered conversations, the talk of great rewards the king had promised to the man who killed Goliath, riches, his daughter's hand in marriage, and tax-free status for his family. But what captured David's attention was not the reward. It was the defiance itself. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" he asked the men standing near him, his voice laced not with bravado, but with a genuine, bewildered outrage, that he should defy the armies of the living God. The question was a spark of faith in a camp of fear. For David, this was not a contest of physical might, but a spiritual insult, a direct challenge to the honor of the God of Israel. Word of the brash young man's questions reached King Saul, and David was summoned to the royal tent. He stood before the troubled king, his frame lean and wiry from years in the wilderness, his face still bearing the softness of youth. "Let no man's heart fail because of him," David said, his confidence unshakable. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul looked at the boy, then back toward the valley where the giant paced. The disparity was laughable, a cruel joke. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him," Saul protested, "for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." But David's resume was not written on scrolls of military campaigns. It was etched in the wild places where he kept his father's sheep. He spoke of facing lions and bears, of seizing them by the beard and striking them down when they threatened the flock. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear," he declared, his eyes alight with a fierce conviction, "will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, desperate for any glimmer of hope, relented. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." He then offered David his own royal armor, the bronze helmet and the heavy coat of mail. David put them on, strapped the king's sword over the armor, and tried to walk. He was immobilized, a boy playing dress-up in a man's world. The tools of conventional warfare were a prison to him. "I cannot go with these," he said, taking them off, "for I have not tested them." His strength had never been in forged metal. It was in a tested faith. He walked back down to the stream that ran through the valley, his movements now free and familiar. He bent down and carefully selected 5 smooth stones from the water, their surfaces worn smooth by the current, perfect for the pouch of his shepherd's sling. With his staff in one hand and his sling in the other, he walked out into the no-man's land between the armies, a solitary figure advancing toward a colossus. When Goliath saw what was coming toward him, his reaction was one of pure, insulted rage. He saw a ruddy, handsome youth armed with what appeared to be a stick. He felt despised. "Am I a dog," he roared, "that you come to me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods and promised to feed his flesh to the birds and beasts. The air itself seemed to crackle with the giant's fury, but David did not flinch. His voice, though younger, rang out clear and strong, a counterpoint to the giant's bluster. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin," he shouted, "but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." He declared that the battle was the Lord's, and that God would give the Philistine into his hand this very day. The entire valley, both armies holding their breath, became the congregation for this sermon of faith delivered by a shepherd boy. As Goliath began his lumbering, menacing advance, David did not retreat. He ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the giant. His hand moved to his pouch, his fingers closing around one of the smooth stones. In a motion practiced 10,000 times in the fields of Bethlehem, a motion born of protecting sheep from predators, he loaded the stone into the sling. He whirled it overhead, the leather thongs cutting a swift, singing circle in the air. There was a brief, humming tension, and then he released. The stone, propelled by skill and faith, became a missile of divine purpose. It flew straight and true, a small, unerring speck against the giant's bulk, and struck Goliath square in the forehead, embedding itself in his skull. The giant's towering form staggered. The contempt in his eyes was replaced by a blank, sudden shock. His legs buckled, and he crashed face down to the ground with a sound that echoed like a falling tree. The mighty Goliath was dead, felled not by a warrior's sword, but by a shepherd's stone and the unseen hand of God. A stunned silence held for a heartbeat, and then a roar erupted from the Israelite ranks. The fear that had shackled them for 40 days shattered, replaced by a furious, liberating courage. They surged forward with a great shout, pouring into the valley as the Philistines, their champion dead and their morale broken, turned and fled in terror. The pursuit was swift and merciless, the victory total. David, meanwhile, walked to the fallen giant standing over the still form. He drew Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, and with it cut off the giant's head, a final, grisly testament to the completeness of God's deliverance. When the soldiers returned, they plundered the abandoned Philistine camp, their hands filled with the spoils of a battle won by faith. David, carrying the giant's head, was brought before Saul, the boy whose trust had accomplished what an entire army could not. The thematic truth resonated through the cheers of the people and the quiet awe of the king. True courage against overwhelming challenges is not born from one's own strength or resources, but from a steadfast faith in the power and faithfulness of God, who delights in supporting the humble and confounding the mighty. Chapter 16, Elijah fed by ravens. The word of the Lord was a fire in his bones, a conviction that sent him striding into the throne room of a king, his solitary figure a stark contrast to the gilded opulence of Samaria. Elijah the Tishbite, a man from the wild places, stood before Ahab and delivered a sentence that sucked the moisture from the very air. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, he declared, his voice cutting through the court's whispers, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. The proclamation was a direct challenge to the storm god Baal, the deity Ahab and his queen Jezebel worshipped with such fervent apostasy. Having delivered this divine ultimatum, Elijah turned and walked out, the echo of his words hanging in the suddenly dry and anxious atmosphere. The king's fury would be swift and murderous, but Elijah was not to stand and face it. A new command, quieter but just as urgent, sent him eastward, away from the centers of power, into the lonely, deepening silence of a world beginning to parch. He became a fugitive of faith, his path leading him to the Wadi Cherith, a ravine that cut a jagged scar into the wilderness east of the Jordan. It was a place of stark isolation, where the only sounds were the scuttle of lizards on hot stone and the occasional mournful cry of a bird of prey. Here, at the command of the Lord, he was to hide. A brook, fed by distant springs not yet fully claimed by the drought, still trickled along the ravine's floor, its water a precious silver thread in a landscape of brown and gray. It was a place of divine appointment, a sanctuary of solitude where the prophet would be stripped of every human support, his survival dependent on a provision as mysterious as it was certain. In the deepening drought, as the first cracks appeared in the earth and the hills began to bake, Elijah's life narrowed to the basics of water and bread, his existence a quiet vigil in the crucible of God's care. Then came the messengers. They were not angels with shining faces, nor fellow prophets with words of encouragement. They were ravens, birds of carrion and ill omen, their feathers black as soot, their cries harsh and guttural. In the logic of the natural world, they were agents of death, scavengers drawn to weakness and decay. Yet, at the Lord's command, their nature was overruled. Each morning and each evening, as the sun painted the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple, their dark shapes would appear against the sky, their flight purposeful and direct. They would descend to where Elijah waited, their wings beating the dusty air. In their beaks they carried not rotting flesh, but fresh bread and meat. They came with the reliability of the dawn, these unlikely caterers of heaven, depositing their miraculous provisions before the prophet, before winging back into the wilderness. Day after day, the rhythm held. Elijah would drink from the dwindling brook, and the ravens would arrive with his sustenance. The bread was coarse and nourishing, the meat a welcome strength in his lean frame. It was a meal that defied every circumstance. The land was entering a famine, fields withering, and livestock dying. Yet in this lonely ravine, a man was fed with a precision and regularity that shamed the most organized of royal kitchens. The ravens, creatures of instinct and appetite, became instruments of divine faithfulness, their black wings a daily testimony to a God who commands even the most unclean and unlikely of servants to accomplish his purposes. For Elijah, each piece of bread, each portion of meat, was a tangible lesson in trust. His life was being sustained by a power that worked outside of human systems and natural laws, a quiet, continuous miracle in the wilderness. The weeks stretched into months. The brook, which had once chuckled over its stony bed, began to falter. Its flow weakened to a trickle, then to a series of isolated muddy pools that shrank under the relentless sun. Finally, the day came when Elijah went to the stream bed and found only dry, cracked clay. The last visible source of water was gone. The ravens still came with their food, but the absence of water presented a new, more immediate threat. The provision had changed, not because God's faithfulness had diminished, but because the season of hiding by Cherith was over. The drying of the brook was not a failure of God's care, but the next step in his guidance. It was a gentle push out of the sanctuary of solitude and back toward a world in desperate need, a preparation for a greater confrontation. The one who had been kept safe and nourished in obscurity was being prepared through this very isolation and dependence for a very public service. In the lonely, difficult times by the brook, God had proven himself a keeper of his servants, his care a constant, quiet presence in the midst of a gathering storm. Chapter 17. Elijah and the Fire from Heaven. The drought had become a third inhabitant of the land, a silent, searing presence that cracked the earth and bleached the sky. For 3 years, Not a drop of rain had fallen, a judgment pronounced by a solitary prophet, and now felt in the hollow cheeks of every child, the brittle stalks of every field. The brook Cherith was a distant memory, its dry bed a symbol of a grace withdrawn, and Elijah himself had been a ghost, moving from one hidden refuge to another, sustained by a widow's dwindling flour and oil in a foreign land. But now the word of the Lord came again, a summons to return and confront the source of the nation's apostasy. The time for hiding was over. The time for a definitive public verdict had arrived. Elijah emerged from obscurity and presented himself to the obdurate King Ahab. The meeting was charged with the tension of years of famine and blame. Ahab's greeting was an accusation. "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" Elijah's reply turned the charge on its head. The trouble was not his, but theirs, born of abandoning the commandments of the Lord to follow the Baals. The prophet's voice, honed in solitude, carried an authority that brooked no argument. He issued a command that was also a challenge. Summon all Israel to Mount Carmel, and bring with them the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. It was a call to a divine duel, a showdown on a national stage to settle, once and for all, the question that had plunged the nation into drought. Who was the true God? The people came, a vast, uncertain multitude flowing up the slopes of Carmel, their faces gaunt from hunger, their spirits parched from the long spiritual famine. They stood in a silent, waiting mass, a nation poised between two opinions. On one side stood the prophets of Baal, resplendent in their ritual vestments, confident in their numbers and royal patronage. On the other stood Elijah alone, his leather girdle and worn cloak a stark contrast to their finery, a solitary figure against the collective power of a state-sponsored lie. His voice cut through the murmuring, a clear, sharp question aimed at the heart of the people's confusion. How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. The silence that followed was profound, a nation holding its breath, unable to answer. With the people as witnesses, Elijah laid out the terms of the test. 2 bulls were to be prepared for sacrifice. The prophets of Baal would choose one, cut it in pieces, and lay it on wood, but put no fire to it. He would do the same with the other bull. Then they would each call upon the name of their God, and the God who answered by fire, he was God. The proposition was breathtaking in its simplicity and its audacity. It bypassed theological debate and went straight to the seat of power. Baal was the storm god, the rider of the clouds, the master of lightning and fire. To challenge him on his own supposed turf was to invite a spectacular, humiliating defeat. The people, their interest now fully captured, answered with a collective, "It is well spoken." The prophets of Baal began their ritual with practiced fervor. They took the bull prepared for them and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, their voices rising in a rhythmic, desperate chant. "O Baal, answer us!" But there was no voice, and no one answered. They limped and danced around the altar they had made, their movements growing increasingly frantic as the sun climbed to its zenith and the stone of the altar remained cold and dark. Elijah, watching from the sidelines, began to mock them, his taunts as sharp as flint. "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. The mockery stung, driving them to a greater frenzy. They cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them, a gruesome spectacle of desperate, fruitless devotion. They raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. The altar stood silent, the meat upon it untouched by fire, a monument to a God who was not there. As the evening shadows began to lengthen, and the exhausted prophets of Baal fell silent in their bloodied defeat, Elijah turned to all the people. "Come near to me," he said. They gathered around, their eyes wide with anticipation. He took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, and with them he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. The act was deeply symbolic, a rebuilding of the nation's fractured covenant identity. Around the altar, he dug a trench large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull in pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he issued a series of commands that seemed to defy all logic and hope. Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood. They did so. Do it a second time, he said. They did it a second time. Do it a third time, he commanded. They did it a third time. The water ran down over the offering, soaked the wood, filled the trench, and pooled around the base of the altar. The sacrifice was drowned, the possibility of any hidden spark or human trickery utterly extinguished. The altar was a sodden, hopeless mess, a testament to the impossibility of the task. At the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet stepped forward. He lifted his hands and his voice to the heavens, his prayer simple, direct, and rooted in covenant history. O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. There was no chanting, no self-mutilation, no frantic dancing. There was only a man standing before a waterlogged altar, speaking to his God. The answer was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The fire of the Lord fell from heaven. It was not a gentle flame or a controlled burn. It was a consuming, roaring inferno that devoured the burnt offering and the wood, licked up the water that was in the trench, and turned the very stones of the altar and the dust around it to powder. The heat was a physical force that pushed the people back, the light a brilliance that forced them to shield their eyes. The crackle and roar of the divine fire was the only sound, a terrifying, glorious answer that left no room for doubt. When the people looked again, everything was gone. The bull, the wood, the stones, the water, the trench, all consumed in that single, definitive blast of holy power. A collective gasp, then a roar, erupted from the multitude. They fell on their faces, their earlier indecision vaporized in the face of such undeniable power. The cry that rose from 1,000 throats was a unified confession. The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. The identity of the one true God, so long obscured by idolatry and syncretism, was now revealed in an incontrovertible display of fire. The prophets of Baal, their fraud exposed, were seized, and the judgment prescribed by the law was carried out at the brook Kishon. The showdown was over. The God of Elijah had answered, not with a whisper, but with a fire that consumed everything, proving his supremacy, his faithfulness to his covenant, and his identity as the one true God who answers when his people call. Chapter 18, Elijah raises the widow's son. The silence that fell after the fire on Carmel was a different kind of quiet, a deep, reverent hush that had replaced the clamor of doubt. But the prophet's work was not finished with the public vindication of God's power. The same God who commanded the fire from heaven now led Elijah back across the Jordan, away from the crowds and the political fallout, to a small, forgotten chamber of human suffering. He returned to the town of Zarephath, to the widow who had sustained him during the long months of drought. The jar of flour and the jug of oil had, by a quiet miracle, never failed, a continuous, humble stream of provision in the midst of a national famine. Her home had been a sanctuary of faith, a place where the word of the Lord was trusted more than the evidence of empty granaries. But now, a new and more intimate shadow fell across that humble threshold, a grief so profound it threatened to extinguish the fragile flame of belief that had been kindled there. The boy, the widow's only son, had fallen ill. The fever had come on suddenly, a fire in his small body that no cool cloth could quench. His breathing grew shallow and labored, and despite his mother's desperate ministrations, the life seemed to ebb from him like a retreating tide, until finally there was no breath left in him at all. The stillness in the small upper room was heavier than any drought, a weight of absolute crushing finality. The widow's world, which had already been narrowed to the daily miracle of flour and oil, now collapsed entirely into the small, cold form of her child. The hope that had been nurtured by God's provision curdled into a bitter accusation. As she cradled her son's lifeless body, her grief found a target. When she saw Elijah at the door, her sorrow erupted in a raw, wounded cry. "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." In her anguish, she saw the prophet not as a bringer of life, but as a messenger of judgment, his presence a cruel reminder of her unworthiness that had, she believed, now been punished in the most devastating way possible. Elijah did not answer her accusation with a defense. He saw the depth of her pain, a chasm that words could not bridge. His own heart was moved with a fierce compassion. "Give me your son," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He took the boy's body from her trembling arms, the small weight a sobering burden. He carried him up to the upper room where he was staying, the same room where the boy had likely played and where the prophet had prayed. He laid the small, still form on his own bed, the scene illuminated by the thin gray light from the window. The contrast was stark. The prophet of the God of life, standing in a room dominated by the stark, unnatural reality of death. The miracle of the unfailing oil seemed a distant, trivial memory in the face of this ultimate enemy. Then Elijah turned his face from the small, pale body and toward heaven. His prayer was not a formal, ritualistic petition, but a raw, personal plea, a wrestling with God in the presence of death. "O Lord my God," he cried out, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?" The question was bold, almost confrontational, born of a relationship that could bear such honesty. He stretched himself out upon the child 3 times, his own living body covering the cold one, his warmth a desperate protest against the chill of the grave. It was an act of profound identification and intercession, as if he were trying to physically bridge the gap between life and death, to pour his own vitality into the boy's inert frame. With each act, his prayer intensified, a passionate, repeated cry that was less a request and more a demand of covenant faithfulness. "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." The answer did not come with the thunderous drama of Mount Carmel. There was no fire, no earthquake. It was a quiet, intimate miracle, a reversal of the natural order in the privacy of a small room. Under the prophet's fervent, encompassing prayer, a change began. A warmth, subtle at first, then unmistakable, returned to the boy's cold skin. A faint flush of color touched his pale cheeks. Then a shuddering breath filled the small lungs, followed by another and another, until the rhythm of life was restored, strong and steady. The boy's eyelids fluttered open. Life had returned, a gift given back from the jaws of death, a quiet triumph in an upper room that rivaled the public victory on the mountain. Elijah gathered the now living child into his arms and carried him down from the upper room. He walked back into the main living area and presented the boy to his mother. The words he spoke were simple, but they carried the weight of a restored universe. "See, your son lives." The widow looked from the prophet's face to her son's, her own expression a shifting landscape of disbelief, dawning wonder, and then overwhelming, tearful joy. She took her son into her arms, feeling the solid, warm reality of him, the proof of a power that could reach even into the finality of the grave. Her earlier accusation melted away, replaced by a conviction that went deeper than the miracle of the flour and oil. She looked at Elijah, her voice now filled with a certainty that grief had tried to steal. "Now I know that you are a man of God," she said, "and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." The restoration of her son was more than a personal comfort. It was the divine seal on her faith. In raising the widow's son, God had demonstrated that his compassion was not limited to national showdowns or provisions against famine. It was a compassion that entered the darkest rooms of human grief, that heard the most desperate of prayers, and that held the power to restore life itself, comforting the broken-hearted and revealing his profound personal love in the face of death's most bitter sting. Chapter 19. Elisha and the floating axe head. The rhythm of the work was a symphony of earnest effort, the steady chop of iron against wood echoing through the grove of trees by the Jordan's edge. The company of prophets, a band of men dedicated to the service of the Lord, worked with a collective purpose, their faces glistening with sweat under the bright sun. They were expanding their dwelling, felling trees and squaring logs to build a larger meeting place, a physical expression of their growing community and their shared devotion. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut timber and damp earth, a smell of progress and promise. Among them moved Elisha, the man of God, not as a distant overseer, but as a fellow laborer, his presence a quiet, steadying force. He shared in their toil, his hands as calloused as theirs, his spirit intertwined with their collective endeavor. The scene was one of holy industry, a picture of God's work being advanced through the concerted physical labor of faithful men. One of the younger prophets, his muscles still learning the stubborn ways of the wood, swung his axe with vigorous, if unrefined, determination. The axe was not his own. It was a borrowed tool, a valuable piece of iron entrusted to him for the task. As he brought the blade down in a powerful arc against a particularly resilient trunk, the head of the axe, the heavy sharpened iron, suddenly flew loose from its wooden haft. It spun through the air, a dark, gleaming crescent, and landed with a definitive, sickening plop into the deep, murky waters of the Jordan River. The sound was small, almost insignificant against the backdrop of chopping and conversation, but to the young man it was a thunderclap of disaster. He stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the spot where the ripples were already fading, his face a mask of horror and despair. A cry of anguish tore from his lips, a sound that halted the work around him. "Alas, my master!" he wailed, turning to Elisha. "It was borrowed!" The words carried a weight far beyond the loss of a simple tool. In a time when iron was scarce and expensive, an axe head represented a significant investment, a trust extended from a neighbor or a benefactor. Its loss was not merely an inconvenience. It was a financial catastrophe for the young man, a breach of trust that could bring shame and crippling debt upon him and his family. The other prophets gathered around, their faces etched with sympathy, but their hands were empty of solutions. The river was deep and its current strong, the bottom a treacherous landscape of mud and sunken debris. The iron was gone, swallowed by the indifferent water, as irrecoverable as if it had vanished from the earth. The hopeful atmosphere of the grove was suddenly thick with a palpable sense of loss and helplessness. Elisha did not scold the young man for his carelessness. He did not launch into a lecture about the proper way to secure an axe head. Instead, his calm, penetrating gaze took in the situation, the distraught young prophet, the concerned faces of the others, the placid surface of the river that hid the source of their trouble. The problem, in the grand scheme of divine portents and national prophecies, was a small one. It was a domestic crisis, an everyday accident. Yet, to the one who suffered its consequence, it was a mountain of anxiety. Elisha's response revealed a profound truth about the character of the God he served. "Where did it fall?" he asked, his voice steady. The young man, his hand trembling, pointed to the place. It was a specific, localized point of failure in the vastness of the river. Elisha moved toward the bank, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He did not call for nets or divers. He did not command the young men to search the riverbed. He cut a stick from a nearby tree, a simple, unremarkable piece of wood, no different from the countless branches littering the ground. There was no incantation, no dramatic flourish. In an act of quiet, unassuming faith, he threw the stick into the river, aiming for the very spot where the iron had sunk. It was a gesture that, to human reasoning, was utterly futile, a childish attempt to solve a grown man's problem. But Elisha was not operating on human reasoning. He was acting in accordance with a power that governs the laws of nature, a power that cares about the burdens of its people, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Then the impossible happened. The dark water where the stick landed began to churn. A stream of bubbles broke the surface, and the heavy iron axe head, which had sunk like a stone, began to rise. It did not merely float to the surface, it broke through the water and rested upon it, defying its own nature, buoyant as a piece of driftwood. It bobbed gently on the current, a dark, glistening island in the river, waiting to be reclaimed. The gasp that went through the company of prophets was one of pure, unadulterated wonder. They had seen fire called down from heaven and armies blinded, but there was something uniquely intimate about this miracle, a display of power that was not about defeating enemies, but about restoring a poor man's loss. "Take it up," Elisha said to the young prophet, his instruction as simple as his action had been. The young man, his earlier despair replaced by stunned disbelief, waded into the water, his eyes fixed on the floating iron. He reached out a hesitant hand and closed his fingers around the familiar cold metal. He lifted it from the water, the weight of it solid and real in his grasp. It was his again, the burden of debt, the cloud of shame, the weight of the accident, all of it lifted as surely as the iron had risen from the riverbed. He held it up, a silent, gleaming testament to a grace that had reached into the depths to retrieve what was lost. The miracle of the floating axe head was a quiet sermon enacted on the banks of the Jordan. It declared that God's help is not reserved solely for national emergencies or spiritual showdowns. His attention extends to the small details of daily life, to the borrowed tools, and the financial anxieties of his servants. He is a God who sees the dropped coin, the lost sheep, and the sunken axe head. He is not too grand to involve himself in the mundane struggles that cause human hearts to fret. In making the iron float, Elisha's God demonstrated that no problem is too trivial to bring before him, and no need is beyond the reach of his compassionate and creative power. It was a miracle of recovery and restoration, a gentle, powerful reminder that the same hand that parts seas and raises the dead is also tenderly extended to mend the small, broken things in the lives of those who trust in him. Chapter 20. Naaman, healed of leprosy. The river of his life, once a torrent of military triumph and royal favor, had slowed to a stagnant, shame-filled pool. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a man whose very name meant pleasantness, yet his existence had become a bitter contradiction. His valor on the battlefield was legendary. The reason for his high standing and the deep respect of his king. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was also a leper. The dreaded disease was a creeping shadow that fell across all his accomplishments, a living decay that no amount of wealth or power could halt. Beneath the polished bronze of his armor and the fine linen of his robes, the pale, scaly patches spread their insidious map across his skin, a constant, intimate reminder of his own corruption. In the glittering courts of Damascus, he was a hero. In the quiet solitude of his own chambers, he was a prisoner of a sentence worse than death, a man whose strength was being steadily, silently eaten away from the inside. The whisper of hope came from an unexpected, almost insulting source, a young Israelite girl, taken captive on a raid, who served his wife. In the quiet of the household, she spoke of a prophet in her homeland, a man in Samaria who could cure her master of his leprosy. The words, spoken with the simple faith of a child, were a spark in the profound darkness of his condition. They were reported to the king, who, eager to preserve his great commander, immediately dispatched Naaman with a letter to the king of Israel and a staggering fortune in gifts. 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. The caravan that set out from Damascus was a spectacle of wealth and desperate hope, a grand procession moving from a land of pagan gods toward the territory of a seemingly powerless nation, its purpose as audacious as it was specific. The king of Israel, however, received the Syrian delegation with terror. He read the letter demanding he cure Naaman of his leprosy and saw it not as a plea, but as a pretext for war. He rent his clothes, wailing that he was not God, that he had no power over life and death. The mission seemed doomed, a diplomatic catastrophe born of a slave girl's naive faith. But the prophet Elisha heard of the king's distress and sent a message. "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." The invitation shifted the stage from the palace to the prophet's humble door, from royal power to divine authority. Naaman, with his horses and chariots and his impressive retinue, arrived at Elisha's dwelling, filling the narrow street with the dust and grandeur of his arrival. He expected a personal audience, a dramatic ritual, a wave of the hand, and an incantation to his God. Instead, Elisha did not even bother to come out. He sent a messenger with instructions that were as simple as they were demeaning. "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." The prescription was an affront to Naaman's pride. He had traveled with a king's ransom, and he was being told to go bathe in a muddy, inferior river. He stormed away in a rage, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper." He fumed to his servants. "Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" His pride had constructed a fortress around his suffering, and the key to his deliverance seemed too cheap, too common, to be worthy of him. He wanted a cure that matched his status, a miracle commensurate with his wealth and importance. He was prepared for a great thing, and the command to perform a simple, humiliating act felt like an insult. He turned his chariot around, ready to abandon the entire venture and return to Syria with his leprosy and his pride intact. The healing was being offered, but it required a price he was unwilling to pay: the complete surrender of his self-sufficiency and his sense of worth. It was his servants, those who traveled with him and saw his suffering more clearly than he saw it himself, who approached him with wise and gentle words. "My father," one of them said, his voice calm and reasonable, "if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much rather, then, when he says to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" The logic was inescapable. It pierced through the layers of his offended dignity and reached the raw, desperate need beneath. The great thing was not the act itself, but the obedience it required, the humility to accept God's grace on God's terms, not his own. The battle was not against the leprosy, but against the pride that valued his own judgment above the prophet's command. A profound stillness fell upon Naaman there on the road. The rage drained from him, leaving behind a weary emptiness. The truth of his servant's words settled in his spirit. Swallowing his pride, he turned his chariot once more, this time towards the Jordan. He descended from his vehicle, stripped off the fine clothes that marked his rank, and walked into the muddy, tepid water, a mighty commander humbled to the level of a common beggar. He dipped himself once. He emerged, his skin still marred by the disease, a second time, a third, a fourth. Each time He looked at his arms and torso and saw no change. The fifth and sixth immersions yielded the same result. Doubt must have whispered in his ear, mocking his foolishness. But he had come this far, driven now by a fragile, obedient faith. He submerged himself for the seventh time. When he rose from the water that final time, a miracle had occurred. He looked down at his flesh, and it was like the flesh of a little child. The scaly, dead patches were gone. The pallor of sickness was replaced by the healthy, vibrant glow of new skin. The leprosy was not merely improved, it was utterly eradicated. He was clean. He raised his hands, turning them over in the sunlight, disbelief and a dawning, rapturous joy warring on his face. The water of the Jordan, so despised moments before, had been the conduit of a divine power that could reverse decay and make all things new. He had obeyed the foolish, simple command, and in that obedience he had found a healing that all the wealth and power of Syria could never have purchased. He returned to Elisha's house, a transformed man, his body healed and his spirit humbled. He stood before the prophet, no longer a proud general, but a grateful supplicant. "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel," he confessed. His statement was a renunciation of the gods of Damascus, a transfer of allegiance to the God who had healed him. He offered the lavish gifts he had brought, but Elisha refused them. The healing was a gift of grace, not a transaction. It could not be bought. Naaman's healing was more than physical. It was a lesson in the very heart of faith. God's healing power and boundless grace were available not just to Israel, but to anyone, even a foreign commander, who would lay aside their pride and embrace the blessing that comes through simple, trusting obedience. Chapter 21. Daniel in the lion's den. The decree was a snare woven from silk and sealed with the king's own signet, a piece of parchment that carried the weight of absolute law. For 30 days, no petition was to be made to any god or man save to King Darius himself. The penalty for disobedience was as brutal as it was ancient, to be cast into the den of lions. The law of the Medes and Persians, once established, could not be altered, not even by the king who had been manipulated into signing it. The scheming satraps and high officials, their hearts festering with jealousy over Daniel's unparalleled spirit and the king's clear favor, had crafted this trap with cunning precision. They knew the one unshakable constant in the life of the aged administrator, the one loyalty that superseded even his duty to the throne. They knew Daniel prayed. In his upper room, the windows opened wide toward Jerusalem, as they had been 3 times a day for a lifetime. Daniel learned of the signed decree. The city of Babylon stretched out below him, a monument to transient power and shifting allegiances. But his gaze was fixed on a distant, enduring hope. He knew the consequences. He understood the malice behind the law. The choice before him was stark: a temporary, prudent silence to preserve his life, or a faithful, public continuation of the communion that was the very bedrock of his existence. For Daniel, there was no choice at all. He did not bar his windows. He did not whisper his prayers into a pillow. He went to his room, knelt down as was his custom, and gave thanks to his God, his voice carrying on the still evening air a deliberate and peaceful act of defiance. His faith was not a private sentiment to be hidden in times of pressure. It was his public identity, the core of who he was, and he would not disguise it, even under the threat of the pit. The conspirators, watching and waiting, found him just as they knew they would. They rushed to the king, their faces masks of feigned concern. "Did you not sign an injunction?" they reminded him, their words laced with poisonous satisfaction, "that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions?" The king's confirmation was given, and they presented their evidence. Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. The trap was sprung. The words struck Darius with the force of a physical blow. He saw too late the malicious intent that had used his own authority to destroy the one man in his kingdom he trusted implicitly. He spent the rest of the day in a torment of regret, his mind laboring to find some legal loophole, some way to deliver Daniel from the fate his own carelessness had sealed. As the sun set, casting long shadows that seemed to race toward the inevitable hour, the conspirators returned, their insistence a relentless tide. The law was the law. The king, his spirit crushed by the immovable machinery of his own empire, gave the order. Daniel was brought before him. The king's final, anguished words were a testament to the faith he had witnessed in his servant. "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." It was a hope flung against the cold stone of reality, a prayer from a pagan king to the God of a condemned man. Then Daniel was led away, and the stone was rolled over the mouth of the lion's den, sealed with the king's own signet and the seals of his lords, making the verdict as irreversible as the law itself. The night that passed was one of stark contrast. In his palace, King Darius refused all entertainment. Food held no appeal, music no comfort. He spent the hours in a silent vigil, pacing the marbled floors, his sleep banished by the image of his faithful friend in the darkness below, surrounded by the padding of heavy paws and the low, hungry growls of the great cats. The night was long and filled with a king's regret. Down in the den, however, a different reality held sway. The lions, their eyes gleaming in the deep gloom, their powerful muscles coiled, were held in check by an invisible presence. Their mouths, designed for tearing and crushing, were shut. They did not merely ignore Daniel, they were rendered harmless, their ferocity neutralized by a command from a higher throne. Daniel, perhaps seated calmly against the cold stone wall, spent the night not in terror, but in the peace of divine company, a living testament to the promise of protection for those who remain unshakably faithful, even in the mouth of the pit. With the first gray light of dawn, the king, his face haggard with a sleepless night of grief, hurried to the den. His voice, torn with hope and dread, echoed down into the darkness. "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" The answer that came back was clear, strong, and immediate, a voice from the realm of the dead. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm." The words were not a boast, but a simple declaration of a night spent under the shadow of the Almighty. A joy so profound it was almost painful swept through Darius. He commanded that Daniel be brought up from the den. They hauled him out, and not a scratch was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The miracle was complete. But the king's justice, now awakened, turned toward the architects of the evil decree. The men who had maliciously accused Daniel, along with their wives and children, were cast into the den that had been intended for him. The law they had crafted became their own executioner. The lions, their divinely imposed restraint lifted, proved how real the danger had been, overpowering them and breaking all their bones in pieces before they even reached the bottom of the den. In the aftermath, King Darius issued a new decree, this one born of witnessed miracle and personal conviction. It went out to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwelled in all the earth, declaring that the God of Daniel was to be feared and revered. For he is the living God, the proclamation read, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. Daniel continued to prosper through the reigns of Darius and Cyrus the Persian, his faith vindicated, his God glorified. The lion's den, intended as a grave, became a throne room where the power of faithful prayer and the reality of divine intervention were displayed for all of history, a permanent witness to the truth that God's protection is a sure shield for those who choose integrity over safety and loyalty to him over the laws of men. Chapter 22, The Fiery Furnace. The statue was a monstrosity of gold, a towering idol that caught the Mesopotamian sun and threw it back in a blinding, arrogant glare. It stood on the plain of Dura, a colossus erected by the decree of King Nebuchadnezzar, a testament to his own power and the unity he sought to impose upon his vast conquered empire. The command that echoed across the plain was as absolute as the metal from which the image was forged. At the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, every people, nation, and language were to fall down and worship the golden statue. The penalty for refusal was as swift as it was terrifying. They would be cast immediately into a burning fiery furnace. The air itself seemed to thicken with the threat, a mixture of incense, fear, and the collective intake of breath from a multitude compelled to choose between conscience and self-preservation. Among the crowd of satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, justices, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, 3 men stood with a stillness that set them apart. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hebrew exiles promoted to high positions in the administration of Babylon, heard the music begin. The symphony was a carefully engineered trigger for idolatry, a cascade of notes designed to command universal obeisance. All around them, as if a single wind had blown over a field of wheat, the vast assembly dropped to their knees, their faces pressed to the dust in a gesture of forced homage. But the 3 Jews remained standing. Their bodies were like pillars of conviction in a sea of bowed backs, their refusal a silent, deafening protest in the face of absolute power. They would not bend their knees. They would not acknowledge the God of gold. Their allegiance was reserved for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the unseen, who could not be fashioned by human hands. The report was brought to the king by certain Chaldeans, their voices sharp with malicious glee. They named the 3 Jews, highlighting their foreignness and their ingratitude. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Nebuchadnezzar's reaction was a storm of furious contradiction. In his rage and fury, he commanded the three men to be brought before him. He offered them a chance to recant, a final opportunity to conform when the music sounded again. But his offer was laced with the old, proud challenge. "And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" The three men stood before the enraged monarch, the heat of his anger almost as palpable as the heat of the furnace being prepared for them. They did not request a lawyer or plead for time. Their answer was a masterpiece of faithful defiance, a declaration that separated their duty to the king from their devotion to their God. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." They stated the undeniable truth. Their God was able to deliver them from the burning fiery furnace and from the king's hand. But then they voiced the core of a faith that trusts in God's character, not just his power, to rescue. "But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Their trust was not conditional upon their deliverance. They would be faithful, even if it meant the fire. Their loyalty was to God himself, not to the outcome they desired. The king's fury knew no bounds. His face was distorted with wrath, the last vestige of reason consumed by the insult to his authority. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than it was usually heated. The order was a frenzy of overkill, a testament to the depth of his offended pride. The strongest soldiers in his army were ordered to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments. The men were trussed up, helpless bundles of faith, and carried by the powerful guards toward the roaring mouth of the furnace. The heat was so intense that the soldiers who carried them were themselves killed, their bodies consumed by the blast of superheated air that erupted from the opened door. The three friends, still bound, tumbled into the very heart of the inferno, their fate seemingly sealed. King Nebuchadnezzar rose from his throne and approached the furnace door, his curiosity battling with his rage. He peered into the raging flames, the heat searing his face even at a distance. What he saw there stole the breath from his lungs and froze the blood in his veins. The bonds had been burned away, but the men were not being consumed. They were walking about in the midst of the fire, unharmed and unafraid, and they were not alone. A fourth figure walked with them, a form whose appearance was not that of a man, but like a son of the gods. His presence in the flames was a greater miracle than the preservation of the three. He was a being of light and peace in the heart of destruction, a divine companion in the place of torment. The fire had no power over their bodies, their hair was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. The king, his arrogance shattered by the impossible sight, stumbled to the opening of the furnace, his voice trembling with a fear greater than any he had ever known. "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here," he called. They emerged from the heart of the furnace, stepping out onto the soot-stained ground as if walking from a cool garden. The satraps, prefects, governors, and royal counselors gathered around them. They saw that the fire had not had any power over their bodies. Not a hair of their head was singed, their cloaks were not scorched, and the smell of fire was not on them. The only thing that had been burned away were the ropes that had bound them. Nebuchadnezzar, his worldview overturned, could only speak a blessing. "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," he declared, his voice echoing across the now silent plain, "who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." The decree that followed was a complete reversal. He made a new law for every people, nation, and language. Anyone who spoke anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins. The king, who had demanded worship for a statue of gold, now acknowledged the sovereignty of the God who could walk in fire. He promoted the three men to even higher positions in the province of Babylon, their faithfulness in the face of extreme danger not only bringing about their own miraculous deliverance, but also resulting in the public proclamation of God's supreme power to a pagan king and his entire empire. Chapter 23, Jonah and the Big Fish. The command was a barbed hook in the soul of the prophet, a divine summons that felt less like a calling and more like a condemnation. "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." The words echoed in Jonah's mind, each syllable a hammer blow against his sense of justice and national pride. Nineveh was the capital of the brutal Assyrian Empire, a city steeped in cruelty, a byword for violence and oppression against his own people. To preach repentance to them was to offer his enemies a chance to escape the judgment they so richly deserved. It was an unthinkable mission, a grace too wide, a mercy too profound for his vengeful heart to comprehend. Instead of arising and going east to Nineveh, Jonah arose and fled west, toward Tarshish, toward the very edge of the known world, as if he could outrun the presence of the Lord. He found a ship in the port of Joppa, paid the fare, and went down into its dark hold, seeking to hide from the omnipresent God in the belly of a man-made vessel, a fugitive not from a king's decree, but from the unsettling compassion of his own God. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. The gentle swell that had lulled Jonah into a false sense of security transformed into a raging, mountainous chaos. A storm of such ferocity arose that the ship itself seemed on the verge of being torn to splinters. The seasoned sailors, their faces etched with a terror they had never known, cried out each to his own God and began throwing the cargo overboard in a desperate attempt to lighten the ship. Below deck, Jonah, the cause of the tempest, had sunk into a deep, troubled sleep, a slumber of moral exhaustion. The captain found him and shook him awake, his voice ragged with fear. "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." The storm was the divine interrogation, and the lot, when they cast it, pointed unerringly to the sleeping prophet. The questions came fast and sharp. "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" Jonah's confession was a quiet admission of guilt that carried the weight of the storm. "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." The sailors' fear intensified, for they understood that this was no ordinary squall, but the wrath of a specific, powerful deity. "What is this that you have done?" they cried, as the truth dawned on them that he was fleeing from the presence of his God. The sea grew wilder and more tempestuous around them, and they turned to him for a solution. "What shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us?" Jonah, cornered by the consequences of his disobedience, knew there was only one answer. The justice he had wanted for Nineveh was now demanded for himself. "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." The men, reluctant to commit murder, rowed harder, straining against the waves to get back to land, but their efforts were futile. The sea only grew more violent. Seeing the futility of their struggle and recognizing the hand of God in the storm, they cried out to the Lord, begging him not to hold them accountable for the prophet's life. Then, with a prayer for forgiveness on their lips, they took Jonah and threw him into the raging water. The moment he hit the surface, the sea ceased its raging, the wind died, and a great calm fell. The sudden, supernatural stillness filled the sailors with a terrified awe, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. Their pagan hearts turned toward the God of Jonah by the sheer power of his displayed authority. For Jonah, the calm above was replaced by a new chaos below. As he sank into the dark, cold depths, the currents seized him, and a great fish, appointed by the Lord, opened its immense mouth and swallowed him. He did not drown, he was engulfed. He passed from the storm-tossed surface into a realm of absolute suffocating darkness, a living tomb in the belly of the beast. The world narrowed to the cramped acidic confines of the fish's stomach, the stench of digested matter in seawater a constant assault. He was entombed in the deep, surrounded by the rhythmic, powerful workings of a creature's digestion, a man buried not in the earth, but in the bowels of the sea. For 3 days and 3 nights, Jonah remained in this prison of scales and flesh, a prophet in the belly of a fish. His flight ended in the most profound and humiliating of captivities. It was in that utter darkness at the very bottom of his existence that Jonah's heart finally turned. From the belly of Sheol, from the pit of despair, his prayer rose. It was not a prayer of bargaining, but one of remembered grace. "I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice." He recounted the terror of being cast into the deep, the weeds wrapping around his head at the roots of the mountains. He spoke of being driven away from the sight of God's eyes, yet with a desperate clinging hope. "Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God." His prayer was a psalm of thanksgiving in advance, a declaration of faith in the God of salvation, even from the heart of the abyss. "When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple." He renounced the emptiness of idolatry and clung to the steadfast love of the Lord. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish. The great creature, which had been both his prison and his protector, obeyed the divine command. It swam toward the land and vomited Jonah out onto the dry shore. He lay on the sand, gasping in the clean air, his body drenched in brine and digestive fluids, but alive. The second chance was as tangible as the solid ground beneath him. The word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, the same command, unchanged by his rebellion or his ordeal. "Arise, Go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it the message that I tell you." This time Jonah arose and went. Humbled, stripped of his pride, and cleansed by his strange baptism, he walked the long road to Nineveh, a city so vast it took 3 days to cross. He began to go through it, a solitary, bedraggled figure proclaiming a simple, stark message of impending doom. "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." The result was a miracle of repentance that dwarfed the miracle of the fish. From the greatest to the least, the people of Nineveh believed God. They proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth, from the king on his throne to the livestock in the fields. The king himself rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. He issued a decree for a citywide fast, a desperate plea for everyone to turn from his evil way and from the violence that was in his hands. "Who knows?" the king declared, echoing the hope Jonah himself had clung to in the fish's belly. "God may turn and relent and turn from his fierce anger so that we may not perish." And God saw their deeds, that they turned from their evil way. He relented of the disaster that he had said he would do to them, and he did not do it. Jonah, however, was not rejoicing. He sat on a hill east of the city, his heart a storm more turbulent than the one he had fled. He was angry, his sense of justice offended that the God of second chances had given one to his enemies. He had wanted fire and brimstone. He had received divine mercy. The lesson of the great fish had been about God's power to save a disobedient prophet, but the lesson of the withered plant that God provided and then destroyed was about the scope of his compassion. As Jonah mourned the loss of a simple plant that had given him shade, God pointed to the teeming city below, filled with thousands of people who did not know their right hand from their left, and also much cattle. "Should not I pity Nineveh?" God asked, his question a gentle, profound rebuke. The story of Jonah ended not with a prophet's triumph, but with a God's question hanging in the air, a powerful testament to his boundless mercy, his patient offer of second chances, and his deep, abiding compassion that extends even to the most wayward of prophets and the most wicked of cities, calling all who would turn back to him. Chapter 24. God's promise of a Savior. The long night of exile had settled over the soul of Israel, a twilight of foreign domination and spiritual longing that stretched across generations. The memory of David's throne was a gilded ghost, and the echo of Solomon's temple a whisper in the wind. Prophets had arisen, their voices like torches in the gathering gloom, speaking words of warning and lament, their messages often ending in the grim cadence of judgment. But in the heart of this darkness, a different kind of word began to form, a thread of gold woven through the fabric of despair. It was a promise, not for the immediate relief of a single king or the rebuilding of a city's walls, but for a rescue so profound it would redefine the very meaning of hope. The prophets, seized by the spirit of the God who sees the end from the beginning, began to paint a portrait of a coming king, a Messiah whose reign would not be measured in territory or tribute, but in transformed hearts and a restored creation. Among these seers, the voice of Isaiah rang with a particular clarity, a trumpet blast of hope that cut through the noise of political collapse. He spoke of a child to be born, a son given, upon whose shoulders the government would rest. His names were not titles of conquest, but descriptors of a divine character, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. This was no ordinary heir. His kingdom and its peace would have no end, established and upheld with justice and righteousness forever. In a world where kings rose and fell with the brutality of the seasons, this was a vision of a permanence that defied history itself. In another breath, the prophet pierced the veil of time to describe a suffering servant, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. He would be wounded for the transgressions of others, crushed for iniquities not his own, and by his stripes healing would be found. It was a paradoxical portrait of a conquering king who would achieve his victory through submission, and a suffering servant whose death would bring life to multitudes. The promise was not confined to a single prophet. Micah pinpointed the insignificant village of Bethlehem, too small to be among the clans of Judah, as the birthplace of the one who was to be ruler in Israel, whose origins were from of old, from ancient days. Zechariah spoke of a king, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey, a picture of peaceful dominion that stood in stark contrast to the war horses of Assyria and Babylon. He foretold a fountain opened for sin and uncleanness, and a day when the Lord would be one, and his name one. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, spoke of a new covenant, not written on tablets of stone, but on human hearts, a covenant where God's law would be internalized and his people would know him intimately, from the least to the greatest. The sins of the past would be remembered no more, forgiven and forgotten in a final decisive act of grace. These were not mere predictions. They were the unwavering assurances of a faithful God, a divine pledge that his long-term plans for his people were plans for welfare and not for evil, to give them a future and a hope. The promise of the Messiah was the ultimate expression of God's covenant-keeping character. He had promised a seed to Eve in the shadow of the fall, a king from the line of Judah to Jacob, an eternal throne to David. Through centuries of rebellion, through exile and restoration, the thread of that promise had not snapped. It was a lifeline cast across the chasm of human failure, a guarantee that the story of Israel, and indeed of all humanity, was not a meaningless cycle of rise and fall, but a narrative moving toward a specific, glorious climax. The prophets were the stewards of this mystery, the heralds of a rescue that would be both deeply personal, dealing with the sin-sick human heart, and cosmically grand, renewing the face of the earth. The hope they offered was not a vague optimism, but a confident expectation rooted in the character of the promise-giver. The same God who had spoken light into chaos, who had called a nation from one man, who had parted seas and toppled walls, was orchestrating a salvation that would eclipse them all. The Messiah would be the true and better Adam, who would not fail in the test of obedience. He would be the true and better Isaac, the beloved son offered up by his father not on Moriah, but on a hill called Golgotha. He would be the true and better Moses, leading not from physical slavery in Egypt, but from the spiritual slavery of sin. He would be the true and better David, establishing a kingdom that would never end. In the promise of the Savior, every story of deliverance, every act of provision, every glimpse of grace in the long history of God's people found its ultimate fulfillment and its fullest meaning. The prophet's words were a beacon, shining across the centuries, assuring a waiting people that the darkness would not last, that a dawn was coming, and that the faithfulness of their God was their certain and everlasting hope. Chapter 25, remembering God's miracles, from the first fiat of light that shattered the primeval darkness to the whispered promise of a Savior who would one day shatter the chains of death itself. The tapestry of God's interaction with His people is woven with threads of undeniable, often breathtaking power. Each story, a solitary ember in the vast night of human history, glows with the same essential fire, the unyielding character of a God whose love is as relentless as His might. To remember them is not merely to recall a sequence of ancient events, but to trace the consistent, loving hand of a Father who intervenes, who provides, and who rescues time and again, revealing a nature that is both fearsome in its holiness and tender in its compassion. The miracles were never mere displays of strength. They were the very language of His heart, spoken in the dialect of human need. Consider the provision, that most fundamental cry of the creature to its Creator. In the barren emptiness of the wilderness, where the earth yielded only thorns and thirst, He rained down bread from heaven, a delicate, honey-sweet substance that appeared with the dawn's faithfulness. It was a daily lesson in dependence, a tangible reminder that their lives were upheld not by their own foresight, but by His gracious hand. When water was but a memory on a cracked tongue, He did not merely point to a hidden spring. He commanded the most unyielding of elements, the rock itself, to gush forth with a life-giving torrent. For a widow on the brink of losing her sons, He multiplied a single jar of oil into an abundance that paid her debts and secured her future. And in the lonely silence of a desert ravine, He commanded the unclean raven to become a messenger of sustenance, delivering bread and meat to His prophet. In every instance, the method was as creative as the provision was certain, teaching that His resources are never limited by the bleakness of the circumstance. Then there were the rescues, the dramatic deliverances from impossible peril. A family, sealed in a wooden box, floated safely above a world drowned in its own wickedness, a testament to salvation for those who walk by faith. An entire nation, trapped between a vengeful army and an uncrossable sea, watched as a path was carved through the very deep, the walls of water standing as monuments to a power that makes a way where there is no way. A den of hungry lions, their mouths divinely shut, became not a tomb, but a sanctuary for a man who would not cease to pray. A fiery furnace, heated to a murderous intensity, became a promenade for three men and a heavenly companion, its flames unable to so much as singe the hem of their robes. These were not narrow escapes. They were definitive victories, declarations that no power of man, nature, or hell can ultimately harm those who are under the shadow of the Almighty. And woven through the grand narratives of nations are the intimate miracles of healing and restoration, proof that His gaze falls upon the individual as surely as upon the multitude. A Syrian commander, proud and diseased, was cleansed not by a complex ritual, but by the humble obedience of washing in a foreign river. A king lying on his deathbed was granted 15 more years of life because he turned his face to the wall and wept before his God. A widow's son, cold and lifeless, was returned to her arms, his breath restored by the fervent prayer of a prophet. Even a runaway prophet, swallowed by the judgment of the deep, was given a second chance, vomited onto dry land to fulfill the mission he had fled. In these acts, God demonstrated that His power is matched by His personal compassion, that He hears the cry of the desperate and responds to the prayer of the repentant. The enduring theme that binds these disparate stories is the unwavering reliability of God's character. He is the great I Am, the constant in a universe of variables. His love is not a fleeting emotion, but the bedrock of His being, a never-ending current that flows from the throne of grace. His faithfulness is the anchor that holds fast through every storm of doubt, every failure of His people, every instance of human faithlessness. He is the God of the covenant, who remembers His promises when all others have forgotten, who fulfills His word against every earthly odds. The miracles are the exclamation points in the long sentence of His devotion, reminding us that the God who spoke the cosmos into existence is the same God who numbers the hairs on our head, who collects our tears in a bottle, and who promises to never leave us nor forsake us. Therefore, let the remembrance of these wonders be an unshakable foundation for trust. Let the manna in the desert assure us of His daily provision, the parted sea bolster our courage in the face of insurmountable obstacles, and the empty lion's den fortify our resolve to stand faithful. The same power that rolled back the waters of the Red Sea, that shut the mouths of lions, and that raised the dead, is at work still, not in the diminished past, but in the vibrant present of every heart that places its hope in Him. The stories are not relics, they are revelations. They reveal a God whose love is as powerful as it is persistent, as mighty to save as it is tender to heal. In remembering His miracles, we are not looking backward in nostalgia, but forward in hope, encouraged to trust Him always. For His character, proven across the ages, is our eternal and unchanging security.